Somewhere above Mount Olympus, on a night when the stars refused to blink, a queen of heaven looked down at a cradle and decided that the child sleeping inside it would spend his entire life being tested. That child would grow up to be the strongest man the ancient world ever whispered about, and tonight, across 3 unhurried hours, we are going to follow his story so slowly and so gently that long before we reach the end, you will already be asleep. Welcome back to Boring History Narrative. If this is your first time here, you have found the right channel for something very specific. We do not tell history to excite you. We tell it to calm you. Tonight we are drifting into ancient Greece, into a world of marble temples and quiet olive groves, to spend the next 3 hours with the life of Hercules, the son of Zeus, the man who carried the weight of 12 impossible labours on his shoulders, so that you would not have to carry the weight of today on yours. If sleep is what you came here for, let it come whenever it wants to. You do not need to stay awake for a single word of this. Your only job tonight is to breathe, to sink a little deeper into your pillow, and to let this story carry you the rest of the way into rest. Before we begin, take one slow breath in, hold it for just a moment, and let it go slower than it came in. Feel your shoulders drop half an inch into the mattress. Feel your jaw loosen. There is nowhere you need to be tonight except exactly where you are right now. Warm, safe, and listening. If you enjoy this kind of slow, sleepy journey through the ancient world, consider subscribing to Boring History Narrative before you drift off. It costs nothing, it takes 2 seconds, and it means a new quiet story like this one will be waiting for you the next time your mind is too loud to fall asleep on its own. Now, let your eyes close if they have not already, and let us begin far away in a small Greek city called Thebes, on the night the gods decided to change the shape of a family forever. Long before Hercules had a name, before he had ever taken a single breath of mortal air, there was only a woman named Alcmene, lying awake in a modest stone house in Thebes, waiting for her husband to return from war. Thebes at night was a quiet place in those years, the kind of quiet you might recognize from your own street tonight. Cicadas trading slow notes in the dark, the smell of dust cooling after a long day of sun, lamps being pinched out one by one along the narrow streets until the whole city settled into that particular hush that only comes after midnight. Alcmene was a queen by marriage, though on this particular night she was simply a tired woman in a warm bed, listening to the wind move through the olive trees outside her window. She did not know, and could not have known, that the god Zeus, ruler of Olympus, had taken an interest in her that would rewrite the rest of her life. It is said, in the old and unhurried way these stories were once told around low fires, that Zeus disguised himself to look exactly like Alcmene's husband, and came to her that night wearing a familiar face and a familiar voice, and that he stretched that single night out to feel as long as 3, so that no one watching the sky would notice the sun had not properly risen and fallen in between. There is something strange and almost dreamlike about that detail, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. A night stretched 3 times its normal length, the stars holding perfectly still, the whole sleeping city unaware that time itself had slowed down around one small house on one quiet street. Perhaps, if you are starting to feel that same slowness settle over you right now, you are already beginning to understand exactly how that night must have felt. When Alcmene's true husband, Amphitryon, returned home the following day from his campaign, he found his wife oddly unsurprised to see him, as though he had never truly left. It would be many months before the truth of that strange night became clear, when Alcmene gave birth not to 1 child but to 2, born so close together that they shared a single birth night, and yet came from 2 very different fathers. One infant, small and mortal, was the son of Amphitryon. The other, the elder of the 2 by only a matter of minutes, was the son of Zeus himself. His mother named him Alcides at first, though history and legend alike would come to know him by a different name, one that would echo down through thousands of years of storytelling carved into temple walls, painted onto pottery, whispered by children falling asleep, exactly the way you are falling asleep right now. Hercules, now, in the halls of Olympus, far above the quiet rooftops of Thebes. This birth did not go unnoticed. Hera, queen of the gods and wife to Zeus, had long grown weary of her husband's wandering attention, and when she learned that a mortal woman had given birth to his son, something cold and lasting settled into her heart. Hera was not a petty goddess, in the way we sometimes imagine anger, quick and loud, and soon forgotten. Her anger moved slowly, deliberately, the way deep water moves, patient enough to wait years, patient enough to wait a lifetime for the perfect moment to make itself known. And so, on the very night that infant Hercules lay sleeping in his cradle beside his mortal twin brother, Hera decided that his first test would come before he had even learned to walk. The night was warm, the kind of warm that makes a house settle and creak gently as it cools, the kind of warm where a mother might finally gratefully close her own eyes for a few precious hours of sleep. Alcmene had laid both boys down together in a wide bronze shield that served as their cradle, the metal still faintly cool from the evening air, a soft woven blanket tucked beneath their small bodies. The house grew quiet. The lamps burned low, and somewhere in that hush 2 serpents, sent by Hera herself, slid silently through a gap beneath the door, their scales dry and whispering faintly against the stone floor as they moved. They came without hurry. Snakes rarely do. They moved like a held breath, like a shadow deciding which direction to fall, gliding closer and closer to the wide bronze shield where the twin infants lay sleeping. The mortal child, frightened perhaps by some instinct too old for words, began to cry, a small sound in a large dark house. But Hercules did not cry. Instead, still barely more than a baby, he reached out with both small hands, one for each serpent, and closed his fingers around their necks. There was no great struggle, no long and desperate fight of the kind you might expect from such a story. It happened quietly, almost gently, the way the biggest moments in a life sometimes do. The infant simply held on, calm and unafraid, his small hands tightening slowly around each snake, until both serpents stopped moving entirely, and the house was quiet again. When Alcmene finally rushed into the room, drawn by her mortal son's crying, she found Hercules sitting upright in the bronze shield, a dead serpent hanging limp from each fist, looking up at her with nothing that resembled fear. It was the first sign, the very first quiet proof, that this child was not entirely like other children, that some strength far older and larger than his tiny body had already begun stirring inside him, and it would not be the last time the gods decided to test exactly how much that strength could bear. The years that followed that first quiet night moved the way years often do in stories meant for sleeping softly, and without much detail, the way your own childhood might feel now, if you tried to remember it, a blur of warm afternoons and half-forgotten lessons. Hercules grew, as all children grow, though he grew differently than most. By the time he was old enough to be sent away for training, the way many young sons of noble houses were in that world, it was already clear that ordinary teachers would not be enough for him. He was sent, for a time, into the hills outside the city, to be trained by tutors skilled in music, in archery, in wrestling, in the long patient art of driving a chariot. Some of these lessons went well. He learned to shoot an arrow with a steadiness that surprised even the archers who taught him. He learned to wrestle with a grip that grown men could not break. But it is said that his lessons in music went less smoothly, that his enormous, still-growing strength made him clumsy with delicate things, that on one particular afternoon, frustrated by a lyre he could not seem to master, his temper flared for just a moment too long, and something in that lesson ended badly. It was a small, sad episode in an otherwise gentle childhood, and it seemed to remind everyone around him, his mother most of all, that whatever strength lived inside this boy would need somewhere useful to go, or it might spend itself in the wrong direction entirely. So Alcmene and Amphitryon sent him further out, into the wilder hills beyond the city, to live for a time among herdsmen and shepherds, tending flocks in the quiet countryside, far from liars and crowded rooms and anything breakable. It was there, in the slow rhythm of watching sheep graze across long green slopes, that young Hercules seemed to settle into himself. There is something almost soothing about imagining that particular chapter of his life. A demigod destined for impossible trials, spending his early years doing nothing more dramatic than walking behind slow-moving flocks under a wide sky, learning patience the way shepherds have always learned it. One uneventful day at a time. It was during these quiet years, according to some of the old storytellers, that a strange and famous choice was offered to him. Walking alone one evening at a place where two roads met, Hercules is said to have encountered two women waiting for him, each representing a different path his life could take. One, dressed simply, promised him a road of comfort, ease and pleasure, a life without hardship, without struggle, without the burden of striving for anything greater than his own contentment. The other, dressed more plainly still, offered him something far heavier, a life of labour, of difficulty, of endless effort, but one that would end, eventually, in glory that outlasted his own lifetime. The story goes that young Hercules, standing quietly at that crossroads in the fading evening light, chose the second road. He chose difficulty. He chose the long, hard path, knowing it would cost him almost everything, because some part of him already understood that comfort fades quickly, while the memory of a life well struggled through can last for thousands of years. Perhaps you have made a similar choice yourself, somewhere along the way, choosing the harder, better road even when the easier one was standing right there waiting. If so, you already understand something of what this next part of the story is about to ask of him. As he grew into a man, broad-shouldered and steady, Hercules eventually returned to Thebes, where his reputation, quiet as it had been in his shepherd years, began to grow louder. He helped the city in a moment of crisis, is said to have led its defense against a threatening neighboring army, and for this service the grateful king of Thebes offered his own daughter, Megara, to Hercules in marriage. It seemed for a while that this might be where his story settled into something gentle and ordinary. He married Megara. Together they built a home, and in time, children filled that home, small voices, small footsteps, the particular chaos and warmth of a young, growing family. If you have ever built a home like that yourself, filled it slowly with the people you love most, you already know exactly the kind of quiet happiness Hercules must have felt in those years, a happiness he had not been promised by any god, but had built with his own two hands out of nothing but time and care. But Hera had not forgotten him. She had waited, patient as ever, through his childhood, through his years among the shepherds, through his wedding and the birth of his children, and now, watching him settle into a life of contentment he had not asked her permission for, something in her old anger stirred awake again. It is one of the darkest and most difficult chapters in his entire story, and we will move through it gently and quickly tonight, because it is not the details of that darkness that matter to us right now, only the shape of what came after it. Hera sent a madness down upon him, a fog that settled over his mind so completely that he no longer knew who stood before him. In that terrible fog, Hercules lost the very family he had spent years quietly building. It was not his fault, not truly, any more than a storm can be blamed for what it destroys. But the grief that followed, once the madness lifted and he understood what he had done, was heavier than any weight he would ever be asked to lift again in his life. He is said to have wandered afterward like a man hollowed out, refusing food, refusing comfort, sitting alone for long stretches in silence that no one around him knew how to fill. It was in this state, broken and searching for some way to carry the unbearable weight of what had happened, that Hercules made his way to the oracle at Delphi. the ancient sanctuary where priestesses were believed to speak with the voice of the god Apollo himself, offering guidance to anyone desperate enough to climb the mountain and ask. Hercules climbed that mountain heavy with grief and asked the oracle how a man was meant to go on living after what he had done. The answer he received was not comfort, not forgiveness, not an easy way out. The oracle told him that he must go and serve his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns, for a period of years, completing whatever labours the king demanded of him. Only through that long, difficult service, the oracle said, could he begin to atone for what the madness had cost him. And so, quietly, without complaint, Hercules agreed. He travelled to the court of King Eurystheus, a smaller, more cautious man, who had always lived slightly in the shadow of his famous cousin's strength, and who now found himself in the strange position of holding enormous power over the very man everyone considered the strongest in the world. Eurystheus, it is said, was almost afraid of Hercules, and perhaps that fear is part of what shaped the labours he chose to assign him. They were not simple tasks, they were meant to be impossible, each one designed to push Hercules toward failure, toward humiliation, or toward death itself. 10 labours were originally demanded of him, though as you will hear later tonight, 2 of those first 10 were eventually judged unworthy by the king, adding 2 more, 12 labours in total, a number that would echo down through history the way certain numbers sometimes do. 12 months, 12 hours on a clock face. 12 labours stretched across the ancient landscape of Greece and beyond, each one waiting patiently for Hercules to arrive. Tonight, across the next long stretch of this story, we are going to walk slowly through each of those 12 labours, one at a time, the way you might walk down a long, quiet hallway lined with closed doors, opening one, resting in the story behind it for a while, and then moving gently to the next. There is no need to hold on to every detail. There is no test at the end of this. If your mind begins to drift somewhere around the 3rd labour, or the 5th, or the 9th, that is exactly as it should be. Let the details blur softly at the edges. Let the story become less a sequence of events, and more a low, steady hum in the background, the same way a familiar song can play in another room while you sleep, present, comforting, but no longer something you need to follow closely. Let's begin now with the very first labour in the dry hills near a place called Nemea, where a lion unlike any other was waiting. Let's slow down for a moment and go back to the very beginning of this story, further back even than that stretched night in Thebes, because to understand why Hera's anger burned so long and so patiently against a single infant, it helps to understand a little about who she was before any of this began. Hera was not simply Zeus's wife in the way a modern mind might imagine that word. She was one of the oldest and most powerful goddesses of the entire Greek pantheon, queen of the sky and of marriage itself, a goddess whose entire domain, whose entire sense of order and rightness in the world, rested on the sanctity of the marriage bond. And Zeus, for all his power, was famously endlessly unfaithful to her, again and again, across centuries of stories, leaving Hera to carry the particular exhausting grief of loving someone whose devotion could never quite be trusted to stay where it belonged. It is worth sitting with that for just a moment, not to excuse what came later, the serpent sent to a cradle, the madness sent to destroy an innocent family, but simply to understand it a little more fully, the way understanding the weather does not stop the rain, but can at least explain why the sky looks the way it does before a storm. Hera's anger toward Hercules was never really about the infant himself. It was about a lifetime of quiet humiliation, played out over and over across a marriage she could not leave and could not fully trust, and Hercules, blameless as he was, simply became the visible mortal shape that anger finally found to attach itself to. Myths are rarely as simple as a single villain and a single hero. Even Hera, cast so often as the source of every hardship in this long story, was carrying her own long, tired grief the entire time, one that never really found its own resolution until, as we heard earlier tonight, that final quiet reconciliation among the stars. Thebes itself, the city where this whole story began, carried its own old weight of myth long before Alcmene ever lay awake on that strange stretched night. It had been founded, generations earlier, by a hero named Cadmus, who arrived in the regions searching for his sister Europa, who had been carried away by Zeus himself in the form of a great white bull. An entirely different old story, tangled up in the same family of myths. Cadmus, guided by an oracle of his own, followed a wandering cow to the spot where the city would eventually rise, and famously sowed a field with the teeth of a dragon he had slain there, from which armed warriors sprang fully grown out of the earth itself, fighting each other until only a handful remained, the ancestors, it was said, of some of Thebes' oldest noble families. It is the kind of layered, tangled mythology that the ancient world simply lived inside without much need to untangle it fully. One strange story quietly resting on top of another, the way dreams sometimes fold into each other, without any clear seam between them. By the time Hercules was born there, centuries later, Thebes had grown into a proper, settled city, walls built, temples raised, streets worn smooth by generations of ordinary footsteps, no longer quite so haunted by dragons' teeth and sown warriors, though the old stories never entirely faded from memory either. The way old family stories rarely do, retold at gatherings, half believed, half simply enjoyed for the shape of them. It was into this layered, storied world, city built on old myth resting on older myth, that the infant who would become the strongest man in all of Greek legend first opened his eyes, and entirely unaware of any of it. Simply a small, warm weight in his exhausted mother's arms on a night that, unbeknownst to either of them, had already been stretched 3 times its normal length by a god wearing a borrowed face. There's a final small memory worth adding here too, from much earlier in this story, back in the quiet years Hercules spent among the shepherds before any of his labours had even begun. It is said that during this cat time, a great lion had also been troubling the flocks near Mount Cithaeron, an entirely different lion from the famous one at Nemea, smaller and less legendary, but dangerous all the same to the shepherds who depended on their animals for survival. A young Hercules, not yet the hero of any 12 labours, simply a strong young man living quietly among working shepherds, took it upon himself to hunt this lion down, spending 50 days in the surrounding hills tracking it, learning its patterns, waiting patiently through long uneventful nights, until at last he found the right moment to end the threat it posed. It is a small, mostly forgotten story, easy to lose beneath the far more famous lion that would come later, but it holds something worth noticing anyway. Proof that the patience and quiet determination running through his entire later life were not something the 12 labours created in him. They were already there, long before any oracle sent him on his long road of service, already shaping the way he moved through the world, one long, unhurried, patient effort at a time, whether anyone was watching closely enough to notice it or not. 50 days on that mountain, alone, tracking a single lion through unfamiliar terrain, is not so different, in its own quiet way, from 50 ordinary days spent slowly working through whatever difficulty life happens to be asking of you right now. Most of the real work in any long effort is exactly this, unglamorous, repetitive, patient, largely unnoticed by anyone except the person actually doing it. Let that thought settle over you gently now. One final small piece of this story, as the whole of it finally, completely, comes to rest. The hills around Nemea, in that part of ancient Greece, were quiet in the way that dangerous places are often quiet. A stillness that made travellers uneasy without quite knowing why. For some time, a lion had been terrorising the region, moving through the valleys at dusk, taking livestock, and occasionally it was whispered around evening fires, taking more than livestock. But this was no ordinary lion. Its hide was said to be impervious to bronze, to iron, to any blade or arrow a mortal hunter could bring against it, which is precisely, why King Eurystheus chose it as the very first task for his troublesome cousin. If Hercules could not even wound the creature, perhaps, the king reasoned quietly to himself, the lion would solve his problem for him. Hercules travelled to Nemea alone, carrying his bow and a great store of arrows, and for a while he hunted the way any hunter might, following tracks through dry grass, watching the tree line at dusk, waiting in patient silence for a glimpse of tawny fur among the rocks. When at last the lion appeared, Hercules drew his bow calmly and released an arrow with all the strength his arms could offer. The arrow struck the lion's side and simply bounced away as though it had struck solid stone rather than flesh. He tried again and again. Each arrow fell uselessly to the ground, and slowly Hercules came to understand that this labour would not be won with a bow at all. So he set his weapons aside, an act that must have felt strange for a man raised to solve problems with strength at a distance, and instead he tracked the lion back to its den, a cave with 2 entrances hidden deep in the rocky hillside. Quietly, without hurry, he sealed one entrance with heavy stones, leaving only a single way in or out. Then, unarmed, he entered the darkness of the cave himself, to meet the lion on ground where his arrows could not help him, and his enemy's impenetrable hide would not matter, because there would be no blade or arrowhead between them at all, only his own 2 hands. What followed happened in near total darkness, deep in that stone cave, the kind of darkness where sound becomes the only sense you can trust. Low growls, shifting stone, the heavy breathing of 2 enormous creatures locked together in a struggle that seemed to stretch on without any clear sense of time passing. Hercules wrapped his arms around the lion's throat and held on, the same patient, unbreakable grip that had once, long ago, closed around 2 serpents in a bronze cradle. He held on through the animal's thrashing, through the scrape of claws that could not quite reach him, through what must have felt like hours pressed into that narrow, dark space, until slowly, gradually, the lion's great strength began to fade, and then stopped entirely when Hercules finally emerged from that cave into daylight that must have felt impossibly bright after so long in the dark. He carried the lion's body with him, and using the creature's own claws, the only thing sharp enough to cut through its impenetrable hide, he skinned it and wore the pelt afterward as both armour and proof of what he had done. That lion skin would become one of the most recognisable images of his entire life, draped over his shoulders in nearly every painting and carving that would follow him down through the centuries, a soft golden reminder of a battle fought entirely in the dark, won not through any weapon, but through sheer, patient endurance. When he returned to King Eurystheus wearing that pelt, it is said the king was so startled by the sight of him, and so unsettled by what it meant about the strength he was dealing with, that he ordered a great bronze storage jar, built and buried partly in the ground, so that from then on he could receive his cousin's reports from a safe distance, without ever needing to stand face to face with him again. The second labour waited in the marshes near a place called Lerna, low wetlands thick with reeds and standing water, where the air hung heavy and damp even in daylight. Somewhere in those marshes lived the Hydra, a serpent of extraordinary and unsettling design, with many heads rising from a single thick body, and a particular terrible quality that made it far more dangerous than the lion had ever been. If even one of its heads was severed, 2 more would grow back in its place, faster than any wound could be dealt, so that a fight against the Hydra threatened never to end at all, only to multiply endlessly the longer it continued. Hercules did not go to the marsh alone this time. He brought with him his nephew, a young man named Iolaus, who would drive the chariot and wait nearby while Hercules approached the creature's lair. The Hydra emerged from its underground den slowly, its many heads rising and swaying above the reeds like something half plant, half nightmare, hissing low and constant across the still water. Hercules began the fight the way he had begun so many fights before, directly striking at the nearest head with his sword, and watched, with growing dread, as exactly what the old stories had warned him would happen. Happened. Where one head had been severed, two new heads split up from the wound almost immediately, thrashing and hissing, doubling the very danger he had just tried to reduce. It would have been easy, in that moment, standing ankle-deep in marsh water with a creature multiplying in front of him, to feel that the task was simply impossible, that no amount of strength could win a fight that grew larger the harder he fought it. But Hercules paused, stepped back for a moment through the water, and thought. He called Iolaus closer, and together the two of them worked out a different approach entirely. This time, each time Hercules severed one of the Hydra's heads, Iolaus would immediately press a burning torch against the open wound, cauterizing it before any new heads had the chance to grow. It was slow, careful work, the fire hissing against wet flesh, smoke curling up into the marsh air, one head at a time, cut and burned, until at last only one head remained, the Hydra's central head, which the old stories say was immortal and could not be killed by any blade at all. For this final head, Hercules simply severed it and buried it deep beneath a heavy boulder, where it could do no more harm to anyone, sealed away permanently beneath the quiet weight of stone. Before he left the marsh, Hercules did one more thing that would matter greatly in the labours still ahead of him. He dipped the tips of his arrows into the Hydra's poisonous blood, creating a store of weapons so lethal that even the smallest wound from one of them would prove fatal. It was a practical choice in the moment, a hunter simply making use of what the marsh had given him. But it was also, without his knowing it yet, a choice that would eventually reach back into his own future, in ways he could not have imagined. That quiet, smoke-filled afternoon beside the water, when Hercules reported this labour complete, King Eurystheus, perhaps annoyed that his cousin had solved an unsolvable problem for a second time, declared that the labour did not fully count, since Hercules had needed help from his nephew to accomplish it. And so the count of 10 labours would eventually stretch, by the time everything was finished, into 12, each new refusal or technicality from the king adding just a little more distance between Hercules and the end of his long service. If you are starting to feel, right now, the particular heaviness of a task that keeps quietly growing longer, the closer you think you are to finishing it, you are not so different tonight from Hercules himself, standing in that marsh, watching two more heads rise, where he had thought there was only going to be one less. There's a smaller story, easy to overlook, that unfolded during the very first labour, before Hercules ever entered that dark cave near Nemea, and it deserves a slower telling than we gave it earlier tonight. On his way toward the lion's territory, Hercules passed through a small village where he stayed the night with a poor farmer named Melorcus, a man who had lost his own son to the very lion Hercules had come to hunt. Melorcus, grieving and generous despite having almost nothing left to give, offered Hercules the last of his hospitality anyway, a simple meal, a place to rest, the quiet, unremarkable kindness of someone who has very little but still chooses to share it. Before Hercules set out the next morning to track the lion, Melorcus told him that if he did not return within 30 days, he intended to offer a sacrifice to Zeus in his memory, mourning him the way he had already mourned his own son. Hercules asked him instead to wait, to hold that sacrifice until his return, and if he did not return in time, only then to make the offering as a memorial rather than a celebration. It is a small, quiet promise tucked into the very beginning of this long story, easy to lose beneath the drama of the lion itself, but worth remembering for a moment now, a grieving farmer and a young hero, agreeing quietly, over a humble meal, to trust each other across 30 uncertain days. Hercules did return, of course, well within the 30 days, carrying the lion's pelt across his shoulders for the very first time, and found Melorcus preparing to make the sad version of his sacrifice, the memorial rather than the celebration. Together, instead, they made the joyful version, a sacrifice of gratitude rather than grief, and some tellings say that this quiet, humble meal shared between a poor farmer and a hero at the very start of his labours became, in later years, the origin of the Nemean Games, athletic contests held in that same region for centuries afterward, athletes competing in memory of a lion defeated in total darkness, and of a small kindness shared the night before between two men who had very little reason, on the surface, to trust each other at all. It's a gentle reminder, tucked quietly into the beginning of an otherwise enormous, monster-filled story, that even the largest legends are usually built from small moments like this one. A shared meal, a kept promise, a stranger's grief acknowledged rather than rushed past. Whatever small kindnesses pass through your own day to day, however easy they might be to forget by morning, they are, in their own quiet way, made of exactly the same material as this old story has always been built from. The third labour asked something different of Hercules entirely. No monster to defeat, no den to seal shut, but a test of patience so long and so quiet that it might be the labour most suited to a story meant for falling asleep. King Eurystheus commanded him to capture the Ceryneian hind, a deer of astonishing beauty, with antlers of gold and hooves of bronze, sacred to the goddess Artemis, and swift enough that no hunter in living memory had ever managed to catch it. The king likely chose this labour, believing it impossible in an entirely different way than the lion or the Hydra had been impossible. Not through danger, but through sheer patient futility. Hercules pursued that golden-antlered deer for an entire year. Not a single dramatic chase, but a long unbroken season of following, across mountains, through forests, over rivers, always keeping the hind in sight, always just far enough behind that a final capture seemed to slip away each time he drew close. There is something strangely peaceful to imagine in that year-long pursuit, the seasons slowly turning around him as he walked. Summer fading into autumn, autumn into the first frosts of winter, spring eventually returning to the same hills he had crossed months before, the deer's golden antlers catching the light differently in every new season, and Hercules simply continuing, unhurried despite the length of it, because he had learned by now that some labours could not be rushed, only outlasted. It is said that he finally caught the hind not through speed, which he could never quite match, but through patience worn down to its final thread, catching the animal, exhausted at last as it paused to drink from a stream, or, in some tellings, gently wounding it with a careful arrow so that it could be caught without lasting harm. Along the way, the goddess Artemis herself confronted him, angry that a creature sacred to her had been pursued so relentlessly, and Hercules, ever respectful of the gods even in the midst of his labours, explained honestly that he acted not from disrespect but from necessity, under the command of the oracle itself. Artemis, understanding the weight he carried, allowed him to bring the hind to King Eurystheus, on the condition that it be released again afterward, unharmed, to return to its quiet, wandering through the golden hills where it belonged. The fourth labour turned from patience back toward danger, sending Hercules into the mountains after the Erymanthian boar, an enormous wild creature that had been terrorizing the region around Mount Erymanthos, its tusks capable of goring a man from waist to shoulder in a single motion. Along the way to hunt this boar, Hercules stopped to visit a centaur named Pholus and shared a meal and a cup of wine with him, a small warm moment of hospitality tucked into the middle of an otherwise dangerous journey. But the wine, kept in a shared jar sacred to all the centaurs of the region, drew the attention of others nearby, and what began as a quiet meal between two friends spiraled unexpectedly into a chaotic and tragic confrontation, one that cost several lives before it was finished, including, by unfortunate accident, the life of Pholus himself, and the wise old centaur Chiron, who had once helped train heroes including Hercules in his youth, and who was struck by one of the same poisoned arrows Hercules had dipped in Hydra's blood back in that quiet marsh. Chiron, being immortal, could not die from the wound, but the poison caused him unending pain. So much pain that he eventually chose to give up his own immortality entirely, trading his endless life for release from suffering. It is one of the quieter tragedies tucked inside this labour, easy to lose amid the larger story of a hunted boar, but worth pausing on for just a moment. The way a single sad thought sometimes surfaces right before sleep and then gently passes, setting that sorrow aside. Hercules continued on toward the mountain itself, and there he hunted the great boar, not by fighting it directly in open ground, where its tusks and its momentum would give it every advantage, but by driving it, patiently and carefully, up into deep snow near the mountain's peak, where its own great weight worked against it, sinking it into drifts it could not easily escape. There, exhausted and trapped by nothing more violent than snow and gravity, the boar was finally subdued, bound and carried, alive, back down the mountain to King Eurystheus. It is said that when Hercules arrived at the king's court, carrying the enormous, snorting, still-living boar across his shoulders, Eurystheus was so overcome with fear at the sight of it that he leapt into the same large bronze jar he had once hidden in after the Nemean Lion, and begged, from inside that jar, for the boar to be taken away and disposed of far from the palace entirely. If you are still with this story, drifting somewhere between waking and sleeping, you have now travelled with Hercules through 4 labours: a lion faced in total darkness, a many-headed serpent that multiplied the harder it was fought, a golden deer pursued patiently across an entire turning year, and a mountain boar driven, slowly and carefully, into deep, quiet snow. 8 labours remain ahead of him tonight, but there is no need to hurry toward them. Let your breathing slow further. Let the details of this story blur softly, the way distant mountains blur at dusk. We have all the time in the world tonight, and Hercules, patient as ever, is in no rush either. There's one more quiet stop worth making in this story, back near the very start of the labours, at a small overlooked moment involving the Erymanthian boar that we moved through quickly before. After Hercules finally captured the boar in the deep mountain snow, and before he carried it, alive and struggling, back down to King Eurystheus, he is said to have paused for a while at the summit, simply catching his breath, looking out over the wide, cold, silent landscape spread below him. Mountains folding into mountains as far as the eye could see. The world hushed under a fresh layer of unbroken white. There is something worth borrowing from that particular pause tonight. A hero, mid-labour, simply allowing himself a moment of stillness before continuing on, not rushing immediately back down the mountain the instant the boar was subdued, but standing there a while first, breathing in cold, clean air, letting his body recover before asking anything more of it. Even in the middle of an impossible task, it seems, rest still found its way in, small and brief as it was, a single quiet pause on a snow-covered mountaintop before the next long stretch of road began. Perhaps that is worth remembering the next time your own days feel too full to allow for any pause at all, that even the busiest, most demanding chapters of a life still have room, somewhere, for a small stolen moment of stillness, a breath taken slowly at the top of whatever mountain you happen to be climbing, before the next part of the climb continues. Tonight, that pause has stretched into something much longer and much deeper, a full night's rest rather than a single caught breath, but the shape of it is the same, permission, quietly given, to simply stop moving for a while and let your body recover everything the day asked of it. Let your own breathing slow further now, matching that same quiet mountaintop stillness, cold and clean and unhurried. There is nothing waiting below you tonight that needs carrying back down. No boar, no king, no report to deliver. Just this wide, quiet stretch of stillness, spreading out gently in every direction, exactly the way that snow-covered landscape once spread out beneath a tired hero finally allowed, for just a little while, to simply rest. There's another quiet piece of this story worth adding here, something that happened just before the very first labour. when King Eurystheus was still deciding exactly how to test the cousin he feared so deeply. Before settling on the Nemean Lion, it is said the king consulted his own advisors at length, turning over the geography of the entire Greek world in his mind, weighing which dangers might actually prove fatal against a man who had already, as an infant, strangled 2 serpents sent by a goddess herself. There is something almost sympathetic in that image. If you allow yourself to sit with it, a smaller, more cautious man, surrounded by his advisors in a torchlit hall, quietly terrified of the cousin he was about to send into danger after danger, not entirely out of cruelty, but out of something closer to fear itself, the fear of a lesser man standing too close to a strength he could never hope to match on his own. Eurystheus, in most of the old tellings, was never given the satisfaction of watching Hercules fail even once. Labour after labour returned to him completed, sometimes with the very proof of victory carried physically into his own throne room: a lion's pelt, a wild boar slung alive across broad shoulders, a 3-headed hound snarling at the foot of his own bronze hiding jar. It must have been, across those years of service, an increasingly uncomfortable kind of relationship between the two men, a king growing more anxious with every fresh proof of the very strength he had hoped, quietly, that his labours might eventually break. And yet, for all his fear, Eurystheus never once released Hercules from his service early, never once softened the terms the oracle had set, choosing instead, again and again, to hide inside his bronze jar and simply assign one more labour, and then another, stretching a debt that could have ended after 10 labours into a full 12 instead. It is worth pausing on that particular shape of cruelty for just a moment, quieter and less dramatic than any lion or Hydra, but perhaps more familiar to some of us than either of those monsters ever could be. Not an enemy who fights you directly, but one who simply keeps moving the goalposts, adding one more requirement each time the last one is met, out of fear or spite, or some smaller feeling neither fully examined nor fully admitted. Hercules never seemed to argue against it, never seemed to demand the debt be considered settled early. He simply kept completing what was asked of him, labour after labour, until the count, however unfairly stretched, finally reached its true end. There is a certain patience in that, a willingness to let an unfair situation run its full course rather than fighting against the unfairness itself, that might be worth carrying quietly into your own rest tonight, not as something to dwell on, but simply as one more small human thread woven into a story that has always been about far more than just monsters. The 5th labour was, in its own strange way, less about danger and more about sheer, overwhelming scale. King Eurystheus sent Hercules to the kingdom of Elis, ruled by a man named Augeas, who owned more cattle than any king in Greece, herds so vast they seemed to cover entire hillsides like a slow-moving golden tide. For years, perhaps for generations, the stables that housed these animals had never once been properly cleaned, and the result was a task so unpleasant, so physically enormous, that the king clearly intended it as more insult than danger, a labour meant to humble the strongest man alive by handing him something closer to punishment than heroism. Hercules approached King Augeas directly and made him a simple offer. He would clean the entire stables in a single day if Augeas would agree, in return, to give him 1/10 of his cattle. Augeas, confident that no single day could possibly be enough time for such an enormous task, agreed readily, certain he was making a bargain he would never actually have to honour. What Augeas did not expect, and what makes this particular labour feel almost peaceful to imagine, despite its unglamorous subject, was the quiet, clever solution Hercules arrived at. Rather than attempting to clear away years of accumulated mess by hand, an impossible task even for someone of his strength, Hercules instead diverted the courses of 2 nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, cutting new channels that ran the rushing water directly through the stables themselves. The rivers did the work that no man's hands ever could, water pouring steadily through the stalls for the length of a single day, carrying away years of neglect in one long, continuous, unhurried flow, the way a heavyweight sometimes lifts all at once after being carried for far too long. By evening, the stables stood clean, rinsed entirely by the patient, ceaseless movement of river water, and Hercules returned to claim the payment he had been promised. But Augeas, true to the quiet cruelty running underneath so many of these labours, refused to honour the bargain, claiming Hercules had only managed the task because he redirected the rivers rather than labouring by hand. And besides, he added, the labour had technically been assigned by King Eurystheus in the first place, meaning Hercules could hardly claim to have completed it as an independent favour at all. It was a frustrating, small-minded refusal, and it meant that just like the Hydra before it, King Eurystheus would later declare this labour uncounted as well. One more quiet addition to the growing list that would eventually stretch 10 labours into 12. The 6th labour carried Hercules away from rivers and cattle entirely, into a dark marsh near Lake Stymphalis, where an enormous flock of birds had made their home among the reeds, birds unlike any ordinary creature, with sharp bronze feathers they could launch like arrows, and a taste, it was said, for human flesh. They had driven away nearly everyone who once lived near that lake, nesting undisturbed in the marsh's thick, shadowed cover, impossible to approach quietly enough to fight, since any movement through the dense wetland reeds would send the entire flock shrieking up into the sky long before Hercules could get close enough to strike. It was the goddess Athena, wise and steady as she so often was in these stories, who offered Hercules the solution this labour needed, a pair of large bronze rattles or clappers, crafted by the god Hephaestus himself, whose sharp metallic clatter could startle the birds up out of the reeds all at once, into open air where Hercules, standing at the marsh's edge, could finally see them clearly. Hercules climbed a nearby hill overlooking the lake, and when the moment felt right, struck the rattles together, sending a harsh, ringing noise echoing out across the still marsh water. The birds rose in one great startled cloud, thousands of dark shapes lifting into the sky at once, wings beating in a panic that finally gave Hercules the open target he needed. With calm, steady aim, he loosed arrow after arrow into that rising flock, driving the survivors permanently away from Lake Stymphalis, scattering them so far from the region that they were never seen troubling that quiet lake again. 2 labours, so different from one another, a river diverted to wash away years of neglect, and a startled flock of birds driven from the sky by nothing more than a clever, borrowed noise, both solved not through brute force alone, but through patience, cleverness, and a willingness to ask for help when help was quietly offered. If you are drifting a little now, somewhere between the sound of rushing river water and the distant echo of bronze rattles fading over a marsh, that is exactly where this story wants you to be. 6 labours remain. Let's continue gently into the 7th. For the 7th labour, King Eurystheus looked past the mainland entirely, out across the water toward the island of Crete, where a magnificent bull had been causing chaos for the local king, Minos. This was no ordinary animal. Some tellings say it was the very bull sent up from the sea by the god Poseidon himself, a creature of such size and wild temper that it had taken to rampaging across Cretan fields, trampling crops, frightening villages, and resisting every attempt anyone had made to tame or capture it. King Minos, weary of the destruction, was more than willing to let Hercules take the problem off his island entirely. Hercules sailed to Crete, and there, without the aid of ropes or traps or any elaborate device, he simply approached the enormous bull directly, matching its wild strength with his own steady grip, wrestling it into submission, the same patient way he had once held 2 serpents still in his cradle, the same way he had wrapped his arms around the throat of the Nemean Lion, in total darkness. It is worth pausing here, drifting as you are, to notice how many of these labours come back to that same quiet image, Hercules simply holding on, not through fury but through sheer calm endurance, waiting for something wild to finally tire itself out against his patience. The bull thrashed and fought and pulled against him, kicking up dust across the dry Cretan hillside, but slowly, the way every struggle in this story eventually slows, its resistance faded, and Hercules was able to bind it and load it onto his ship for the long rocking voyage back across the sea to the mainland. When he presented the bull to King Eurystheus, the timid king, true form, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the enormous creature, and ordered it released once his official inspection was complete. Freed once more, the bull wandered north across Greece, eventually settling near the city of Marathon, where, in a much later chapter of Greek legend, it would cause trouble again for an entirely different hero to deal with. But that is a story for another night, another quiet hour, and not one we need to follow any further tonight. The eighth labour turned darker and stranger, sending Hercules to the kingdom of a Thracian king named Diomedes, who owned a small herd of mares unlike any other horses in the ancient world. These mares had been trained, through some combination of cruelty and dark magic, to feed on human flesh, kept wild and dangerous by a diet no ordinary horse would ever naturally choose. King Eurystheus demanded that Hercules capture these terrible mares and bring them back alive, a task that meant approaching creatures far more dangerous than they appeared. At first glance, their sleek coats and powerful legs disguising an appetite that had already cost the stables around them a great deal of blood. Hercules travelled to Thrace with a small group of companions, and upon reaching the stables, found the mares kept behind heavy bronze chains, their eyes wild, their temperament unlike anything he had faced in the labours before. In most versions of this old story, Hercules first had to deal with King Diomedes himself, who attempted to stop him from taking the horses, and in the struggle that followed, Hercules is said to have fed the cruel king to his own mares, a grim kind of justice that, oddly enough, seemed to calm the animals almost immediately afterward, as though whatever twisted hunger Diomedes had cultivated in them finally found its match and was satisfied. With the mares finally settled and manageable, Hercules was able to lead them down to the shore, load them onto his ships, and bring them safely across the sea to King Eurystheus, who once again wanted nothing further to do with such dangerous animals once his inspection was complete, and ordered them released into the wild hills, where in time, it is said, they lived out the rest of their days as ordinary horses, their strange and terrible hunger fading slowly, the further they moved from the cruelty that had created it in the first place. 8 labours now sit behind Hercules in this story, a lion faced in darkness, a serpent that multiplied, a golden deer chased across a turning year, a boar driven into snow, a river bent to wash away years of neglect, a flock of birds startled from a marsh, a wild bull wrestled into stillness on a dry Cretan hillside, and now a herd of terrible mares finally calmed. 4 labours remain ahead of him, and they will carry him further from home than he has travelled yet, across seas, toward the edges of the known world, and finally down into the very underworld itself. But there is no need to hurry toward any of that tonight. Let your body sink a little heavier into the bed beneath you. Let the pace of this story continue exactly as slow as it has been, because Hercules, even now, 4 labours from the very end of his long service, is not hurrying either. The 9th labour carried Hercules further from Greece than any task before it, out past the familiar coastlines he had grown up sailing near, into the distant lands along the Black Sea, where the Amazons were said to live, a nation of warrior women who trained from childhood in archery, in horsemanship, in the disciplined art of war, ruled by a queen named Hippolyta. King Eurystheus, or in some versions of the story his own daughter, had heard of a belt Hippolyta possessed, a gift from the god Ares himself, a symbol of her authority and her strength as queen, and it was this belt, simple in appearance but heavy with meaning, that Hercules was sent to retrieve. The voyage itself took a long, slow while, ship after ship of sea days blending quietly together, salt air and creaking wood, and the wide grey horizon stretching on in every direction. The kind of long journey that, if you can picture it now, might feel a little like the slow drift you are settling into yourself tonight, time loosening its grip, one day folding gently into the next, without much urgency behind any of it. When Hercules and his companions finally reached the shore of the Amazons, they were met not with immediate hostility, but with a surprising and quiet curiosity. Queen Hippolyta herself, having heard stories of the famous hero's strength and his long service to atone for a tragedy that was never truly his fault, came to meet him personally and listened patiently as he explained the purpose of his journey. In most of the old, gentler versions of this story, Hippolyta was moved by his honesty and by the weight of everything he had already endured through the labours before this one, and she agreed, without any struggle at all, to give him the belt freely, a simple act of respect between two people who each understood, in their own way, what it meant to carry the burden of duty. For a little while, it seemed as though this particular labour, unlike so many before it, might be completed with nothing more dramatic than a quiet conversation on a quiet shore, a queen and a hero speaking honestly, and an exchange made freely between them, without a single drop of blood spilled. But Hera, who had never once stopped watching this long, unfolding story from somewhere far above it, was not content to let a single labour pass so easily. Disguising herself among the Amazon warriors, she spread a rumour through their ranks that Hercules had come not to ask for the belt honestly, but to kidnap their queen entirely, using the belt as nothing more than a false excuse. The rumour spread quickly, the way rumours always do, faster than truth ever seems able to travel, and before Hercules or Hippolyta could correct the misunderstanding, the Amazon warriors, believing their queen to be in immediate danger, armed themselves and rushed down toward the shore where the two of them stood. What followed was a confusion neither of them had wanted, a sudden chaotic struggle on a beach that had, only moments before, held nothing but a calm and honest exchange. In the panic and misunderstanding of it, Hippolyta was killed, whether by Hercules' own hand, mistaking the rushing warriors for an attack against him, or by some other confusion of that terrible moment. The old stories disagree, and perhaps it is kinder tonight not to settle firmly on either version, only to sit for a moment with the sadness of it, an entire conflict born from nothing but a lie, spoken by a jealous goddess, who could not bear to watch even one labour pass by peacefully. Hercules left that shore with the belt he had come for, but also with a grief he had not expected to carry home with him. One more quiet sorrow folded into a life that already held more than its fair share. The 10th labour pulled Hercules even further from home, to the very edge of the world as the ancient Greeks understood it, to a distant island called Erythea, said to lie beyond the great ocean stream that was believed to circle the entire known earth. There, guarded by a giant named Geryon, who possessed 3 bodies joined together at the waist, lived a herd of magnificent red cattle, tended by a herdsman named Eurytion, and guarded fiercely by a 2-headed hound called Orthrus. King Eurystheus demanded that Hercules travel to this impossibly distant place and bring the entire herd back across the world to Greece. The journey there alone tested his patience as much as any monster ever had. Crossing the deserts of Libya, the story goes, Hercules grew so frustrated with the relentless heat of the sun beating down on him that he raised his bow toward the sky itself, threatening to shoot the sun god Helios directly. Rather than taking offence, Helios, it is said, was so impressed by the sheer boldness of a mortal willing to challenge the sun that he lent Hercules his own great golden cup, the very vessel Helios used each night to sail back across the ocean from west to east after his daily journey across the sky, so that Hercules could use it to cross the sea toward Erythea himself. There is something quietly beautiful about that image, if you let it settle over you for a moment. A mortal man, bow lowered, sailing across a moonlit ocean inside a god's own golden cup, the water dark and endless all around him, carrying him steadily toward an island at the very edge of the world. When Hercules finally reached Erythea, he faced the two-headed hound Orthrus first, and dispatched the creature with a single heavy blow from his club, before turning to face the herdsman Eurytion, who fell just as quickly. Finally, Geryon himself emerged. Three bodies moving together with an unnatural, unsettling coordination. Hercules, drawing on the very bow that had once challenged the sun itself, loosed a single arrow that struck through all three of the giant's linked bodies at once, ending the final guardian of that distant red cattle herd. The journey home, driving an entire herd of cattle back across the vast distance from the edge of the world to Greece, took far longer than the fight itself ever had. Months of slow, patient travel, herding animals across unfamiliar lands, fording rivers, crossing mountain passes, losing a few animals along the way to accident or theft, and having to quietly gather them back again, the kind of long, uneventful, repetitive labour that might, more than any dramatic battle in this entire story, resemble the slow, steady work of simply getting through a long night. By the time Hercules finally delivered the herd to King Eurystheus, months, perhaps close to a year, had passed since he first set out, and true to the pattern by now familiar to us both, Eurystheus, once his inspection was complete, ordered the cattle sacrificed to the goddess Hera herself, a small, bitter irony neither man commented on, the goddess who had caused so much of Hercules' suffering, quietly receiving the reward for one of his hardest-won labours. 10 labours sit behind him now in this story, though, as you'll remember, 2 were struck from the count along the way, leaving 2 more still ahead. We are past the middle of this long, slow night together, and if your mind has already drifted somewhere quieter than this room, somewhere closer to sleep than to waking, that is exactly where it should be. The 2 labours remaining will carry Hercules to a garden at the far western edge of the world, and then down into darkness deeper than any cave or marsh he has entered so far, into the underworld itself. Rest a little longer here first, in the space between labours, before we follow him that final distance. There's a little more worth knowing about that long journey home from the edge of the world. Herding Geryon's red cattle back across countless unfamiliar lands, because the road itself, more than the fight that started it, tested Hercules in ways his earlier labours never quite had. Driving an entire herd of animals across such enormous distances meant days measured not by battles won, but by the much slower, more repetitive labour of simply keeping every animal moving in roughly the same direction, counting them again each evening to make sure none had wandered off into some unfamiliar valley, backtracking sometimes for hours when one stubborn cow decided the herd's chosen path was not the path it preferred to walk. Along the way, the story goes, a single bull broke away from the herd entirely, swimming across a strait of water and eventually making its way as far as Sicily, where Hercules had to pause his entire journey to search for it, asking local farmers and shepherds along the way if they had seen a stray red bull passing through their fields, the kind of small, frustrating detour that must have felt, after everything else he had already survived, almost comically minor by comparison. He found it eventually tending to it the same patient way he tended to everything else, and rejoined it to the rest of the herd before continuing on. In another region, thieves attempted to steal several animals from the herd while Hercules slept, and he woke to find himself chasing down cattle rustlers across unfamiliar hills in the middle of the night, one more small, unglamorous obstacle tucked into a journey that history remembers mostly for its dramatic beginning and its dramatic ending, forgetting, most of the time, just how much long tired. Ordinary walking filled the enormous space in between. It's a fitting shape for so much of this entire story, honestly. The dramatic moments, the fights, the transformations, the golden apples, and the underworld hounds, are the parts that got carved onto pottery and painted onto temple walls and eventually turned into the version you've been listening to tonight. But underneath every one of those dramatic moments was months, sometimes years, of exactly this kind of quiet, unremarkable persistence, counting cattle each evening, backtracking for a wandering bull, simply continuing forward one more day, and then one more after that, because continuing forward was the only way any of these labours were ever actually going to end. Before we continue into the 11th labour, let's pause here for just a moment, the way we might pause halfway through a long walk to simply stand still and breathe. If you are still listening, still awake enough to hear these words clearly, that is perfectly fine. And if you are not, if sleep has already found you somewhere back around the golden cattle, or the quiet shore where a queen once offered her belt freely to a tired hero, that is exactly as it should be too. There is no wrong way to listen to this story tonight. Many of you watching this have written in the comments of earlier videos here on Boring History Narrative to say that stories like this one are the only thing that quiets a mind that has spent all day moving too fast, jumping between emails and notifications and the particular exhausted static of modern life. If that sounds like the day you just had, you are exactly who this story is for. There is no urgency here, no breaking news, no deadline, just a tired hero, still 2 labours from finished, and a slow, unhurried voice walking you gently toward the edge of sleep alongside him. If you would like more nights like this one waiting for you, a subscription to Boring History Narrative costs nothing and takes only a moment, and it means the next time your mind refuses to slow down on its own, a new quiet story will already be here waiting for you. Now, let's continue, gently, toward the far western edge of the ancient world, toward a garden that guarded something more precious than any treasure Hercules had been sent after yet. The 11th labour asked something almost impossible of Hercules, not because it required strength, though strength would matter before the end, but because he did not even know, at first, where the task he had been given could be found. King Eurystheus commanded him to bring back the golden apples of the Hesperides, fruit that grew on a single tree in a hidden garden said to lie somewhere at the very western edge of the world. A gift given long ago by the earth goddess Gaia to Hera herself as a wedding present. Guarded ever since by nymphs called the Hesperides and by a fearsome, never-sleeping dragon named Ladon, whose coils wound endlessly around the trunk of the golden tree. The trouble was that nobody, not sailors, not oracles, not even the wisest men Hercules consulted along his journey, seemed entirely certain where this garden actually was. And so this labour became, before it became anything else, a long and patient search. Hercules travelling from place to place, asking careful questions, following half-remembered directions and half-true rumours, the way you might search, drifting and unfocused, through the last unclear thoughts before sleep finally takes hold completely. Along this searching journey, Hercules encountered the sea god Nereus, an old and shape-shifting figure who was said to know the answer to nearly any question, if only he could be caught and held still long enough to ask him properly. Nereus, true to his nature, transformed himself again and again into flowing water, into flickering flame, into a roaring lion, into a hissing serpent, trying every trick available to slip free from Hercules' grip. But Hercules, patient as he had been with every wild and struggling creature before this one, simply held on through each transformation, unshaken, until at last Nereus tired of shifting shapes entirely, and told him plainly the direction he needed to travel. That direction led Hercules eventually to the Caucasus Mountains, where he encountered the Titan Prometheus, chained eternally to a rock as punishment for having once given the gift of fire to humanity, an eagle sent daily by Zeus to tear at his liver, which regrew each night, only to be torn open again the following day. an endless, exhausting cycle of pain stretching on without any end in sight. Moved by pity for a suffering that had already lasted so unbearably long, Hercules paused in the midst of his own long labour to free Prometheus, killing the eagle that tormented him and breaking the chains that had held him bound for so many years. In gratitude, Prometheus offered Hercules crucial guidance, telling him that he would need to seek the help of the Titan Atlas, who stood nearby at the very edge of the world, holding the entire sky upon his shoulders, and who happened to be the father of the very nymphs who guarded the golden apples he was searching for. Hercules found Atlas exactly where Prometheus had said he would be, standing in patient, endless labour of his own, the whole weight of the heavens pressing down across his shoulders, a burden he had carried for so long it seemed to have become simply part of who he was. Hercules made him an offer. If Atlas would retrieve the golden apples himself, since his own daughters guarded them, and would surely allow their father to gather what he asked for, Hercules would take his place for a while, holding up the sky so that Atlas could finally set down, even briefly, a burden he had carried without rest for so unbearably long. Atlas agreed, and Hercules took the sky's full weight onto his own shoulders, feeling, for the very first time in this whole long journey, what it truly meant to hold up something that could not be fought, could not be outwitted, could not be worn down through patience alone, only endured, moment by heavy moment, for as long as the burden lasted. Atlas returned some time later with 3 golden apples cradled carefully in his hands, and standing there, finally free of his ancient burden even for a short while. He found himself reluctant to take it back up again. He told Hercules that he would deliver the apples to King Eurystheus himself, and that Hercules could simply remain there, holding the sky permanently in his place. It would have been easy, faced with a trick like that, to panic, or to argue, or to try uselessly to fight a titan who no longer wished to resume his ancient labour. Instead, Hercules simply agreed calmly, and asked only one small favour first, that Atlas take the sky back onto his own shoulders for just a moment, so that Hercules could adjust the cushion resting across his own shoulders. Worn thin and uncomfortable after holding such weight for so long, Atlas, seeing nothing wrong with such a reasonable request, shifted the sky back onto his own shoulders for what he believed would only be a brief moment. And in that brief moment, Hercules simply picked up the golden apples from where Atlas had set them down, and walked calmly away, leaving the Titan exactly where he had always been, holding up the endless weight of the sky once more, outwitted gently by nothing more than patience and a quiet, well-timed request. Hercules carried the golden apples back across the long distance to King Eurystheus, who, as with so many treasures before this one, wanted nothing to do with something so clearly sacred and dangerous once his inspection was finished, and returned them eventually to the goddess Athena, who saw to it that the apples found their way safely back to the hidden garden at the edge of the world, back to the guardian tree, back to the quiet, endless watch of the nymphs and the coiled dragon who had always kept them. 11 labours now lie behind Hercules in this long, slow story, and only one remains, though it may be the heaviest of them all. A final journey not across seas or deserts or mountains, but down beneath the world entirely, into the quiet shadowed halls of the dead. Let's return once more to the underworld, briefly, because there was one more encounter down there, worth telling more slowly. Deep among the shadowed fields where the dead wandered, Hercules came across the spirit of a fallen warrior named Meleager, a hero from an entirely different old story, who had died young after a hunt for a great boar, not unlike the one Hercules himself had once driven into snow on Mount Erymanthus. Meleager's spirit, drifting quietly among the other shades, spoke with Hercules for a while, and in some tellings asked him for a favour that would echo forward into Hercules' own later life, requesting that Hercules, once he returned to the world above, consider marrying his sister, Deianira, left otherwise unprotected in the world of the living. It is a strange, quiet detail to imagine. Two heroes from entirely different stories meeting for a moment in the shadowed hush of the underworld. One already dead and settled into whatever rest that realm offered its inhabitants. The other still very much alive, still carrying labours and grief and a future he could not yet see clearly, receiving from a stranger's ghost the quiet suggestion that would eventually shape the rest of his own mortal life. Whether or not this particular exchange happened exactly as the old tellers described it, it captures something true about how these ancient stories were woven together. Heroes and monsters and gods from dozens of separate tales, all existing within the same vast shared world, brushing up against each other's stories in unexpected places, the way your own life brushes up, more often than you might notice, against the quiet edges of other people's stories too. Hercules continued on from that conversation, deeper into the underworld, toward the gates where Cerberus waited, carrying with him, whether he fully realized it yet or not, the seed of the marriage that would eventually bring him both his greatest late-life happiness and, indirectly, through a chain of small mistakes and misunderstandings neither he nor Deianira ever intended, the poison shirt that would finally end his mortal life on a quiet mountaintop. Even in the underworld, it seems, the threads of this story were already being woven forward, patient and unhurried. The way every long story eventually reveals, its threads were connected the whole time, long before anyone involved could have possibly seen the shape of it clearly. For this final and heaviest labour, King Eurystheus demanded something no mortal, before Hercules had ever been asked to attempt and survive. He was to travel down into the underworld itself, the shadowed realm ruled by the god Hades, and bring back Cerberus, the enormous three-headed hound who guarded its gates, allowing the dead to enter freely but never, under any circumstance, permitting them to leave again. The journey down began at a place called Taenarum, a cave along the southern coast of Greece, believed to be one of the few entrances to the underworld accessible to the living. Hercules descended into that darkness slowly, the light of the ordinary world fading gradually behind him with every step, the air growing cooler, thinner, heavier, the way the edges of your own awareness might be fading right now, the ordinary sounds of your room growing softer and further away with every passing minute of this story. Down and down he walked, through passages that seemed to wind endlessly, until at last the darkness opened into the vast, quiet, shadowed landscape of the underworld itself. Rivers of black water moving without sound, pale fields stretching toward a horizon that never quite resolved into anything solid, the murmur of countless souls drifting somewhere just beyond hearing. Along the way, guided partly by the god Hermes, who often served as escort for souls travelling between worlds, and partly by Athena, who had helped him so many times before across this long labour, Hercules encountered several figures from stories much older than his own. He freed the hero Theseus, who had been trapped in the underworld after a reckless attempt to kidnap the wife of Hades, though in most tellings, his companion Pirithous, who had helped plan that same reckless attempt, could not be freed and remained bound there permanently. A quiet reminder tucked into the middle of this labour that not every mistake, however honestly regretted, can be undone. Eventually, Hercules came before Hades himself, ruler of that entire shadowed realm, and rather than attempting to steal Cerberus by force or by trickery, he did something that had marked nearly every one of his labours when handled at its best. He asked honestly, explaining the task the oracle had set before him, explaining the atonement he was still working to earn. Hades, who ruled the dead but was not himself without a certain fairness, agreed to allow Hercules to take Cerberus on one single condition, that he capture the great hound using no weapon at all, no sword, no club, no arrow, only his own bare hands and whatever strength his body alone could provide. It was, in a strange way, a fitting final test, echoing all the way back to the very first labour. That long, dark struggle inside the Nemean Lion's cave, won not through any blade, but through patient, unarmed endurance. Hercules found Cerberus at the gates of the underworld, 3 great heads snarling, a mane, in some tellings, made of writhing serpents, a tail ending in the head of a dragon. He approached without weapons, the way he had approached the lion so many labours ago, and wrapped his powerful arms around the massive hound's necks, holding on through its violent thrashing, through the snap of 3 sets of jaws, trying to reach him from 3 different directions at once. Holding on the same patient, unbreakable way he had held on to everything else across this entire long story, until slowly, gradually, the great 3-headed hound's resistance began to fade, not into death this time, but into a kind of exhausted, reluctant submission. Hercules carried Cerberus up out of the underworld, back through the long dark passage at Taenarum, back into ordinary daylight, and brought the enormous hound before King Eurystheus, who, upon seeing the creature snarling in front of him, reacted exactly as he had reacted to nearly every other terrifying trophy across this entire service, with immediate, undisguised terror, leaping once more into his familiar bronze storage jar, and begging, from inside it, for the hound to be taken away and returned to the underworld at once, the labour complete, no further proof required. And so Hercules carried Cerberus back down into the shadowed realm he had come from, returning him safely to the gates he guarded, and with that final journey, 12 labours, however the count had shifted and stretched along the way, were finally completely finished. Years of service, years of danger, years of patient, exhausting struggle against lions and serpents, and rivers and mountains, and finally against death itself, all of it, at long last, behind him, if you are still listening, drifting somewhere in the space between this story and true sleep. Take a slow breath now, the way Hercules himself might have taken a slow breath, standing at the mouth of that underworld cave, finally free of a burden he had carried. For so long, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. The hardest labours are finished now. What remains of this story moves more quietly, through the later years of a long, complicated life, toward an ending that is sad in places and peaceful in others, the way most long lives eventually are. Let's go back, just once more, into that cave near Nemea, not to relive the struggle itself, which you already know ended safely, but simply to sit inside the darkness of it a little longer, because darkness like that, total and complete, is worth borrowing for your own rest tonight. Picture the entrance Hercules, sealed shut with heavy stones, the last thin line of daylight, narrowing and then disappearing entirely as the final stone settled into place. Inside, the air would have been cool and still, carrying the faint mineral smell of old stone, of earth that had never once felt sunlight against it. Sound would have changed entirely in a space like that, footsteps swallowed almost instantly, breath sounding strangely loud in the absence of anything else to compete with it. That is the kind of darkness worth imagining yourself resting inside right now, not frightening, but complete, private, sealed away from every small distraction of the ordinary daylight world. No tasks can reach you inside a darkness like that. No lists, no notifications, no unfinished conversations replaying themselves uninvited. Just stillness and quiet, and the slow, steady sound of your own breathing, the only thing left to listen to. Let your own room feel like that cave for these last few minutes, sealed gently shut behind you, nothing able to enter, nothing needed from you, except to simply lie still inside the quiet. Let's borrow one more piece of darkness before we finish, this time from much further into the story, from the underworld itself, that vast shadowed landscape Hercules crossed during his final labour. Remember the way the ordinary world seemed to fade slowly behind him as he descended, the light growing thinner with every step, the air growing cooler, the sounds of the surface world falling away entirely until only a deep white silence remained. You are descending into something similar right now, Not underworld, but sleep itself, just as old, just as patient, just as certain to eventually receive every tired traveller who makes their way down into it. There is nothing to fear in that descent. Hercules himself walked through it and returned safely, and every single night of your own life, you have made this same quiet journey yourself, down into rest, and safely back again by morning. Let that thought settle over you now, heavy and warm, the way a blanket settles over tired shoulders on a cold night. You know this road already. You have walked it more times than you could ever count. There is nothing left to do now but let your body remember exactly how it's done, the same unhurried way it always has, with his 12 labours finally complete. Hercules stepped back into a kind of life he had not known for years, a life without a king assigning him impossible tasks, without a fixed and looming purpose waiting for him at the start of every morning. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, the strange quiet that must have settled over him in those first weeks of freedom, the way a long demanding chapter of anyone's life leaves behind an odd, echoing silence when it finally ends, a silence that can feel almost as heavy as the labour itself, until slowly new purpose begins to fill it again. Hercules did not simply rest, though rest, surely, would have been well earned by then. Instead he wandered, the way many heroes of that era wandered once their defining task was behind them, drawn from one adventure to the next by reputation, by request, by the restless energy of a man who had spent so many years in constant motion that stillness did not come easily to him. He is said to have joined for a time the crew of the Argo, sailing alongside Jason and the other Argonauts on their own long, difficult quest for the Golden Fleece, though the old stories differ on how long he stayed with them, some saying he left the voyage early after his young companion Hylas was pulled beneath the water by admiring water nymphs during a stop for fresh water, and that Hercules searched the surrounding forest so long and so desperately for the missing boy that the Argo eventually sailed on without him, leaving him behind on a quiet, unfamiliar shore. He fought in other wars as well during these wandering years, aided cities under siege, settled disputes between kings, and slowly, gradually, began to build towards something resembling a second chance at the quiet domestic happiness that had once been taken from him so painfully. In time, his travels brought him to the kingdom of Calydon, where he met a princess named Deianira, and where, in one of the stranger courtships in all of Greek storytelling, he found himself competing for her hand against a river god named Achilles, who could shift his shape at will, appearing at different moments as a serpent, and then as a bull, each new shape a fresh challenge Hercules had to face and overcome in order to win her. In their final struggle, fought in bull form, Hercules broke off one of Achilles' horns entirely, and the defeated river god, humbled and finally willing to concede, agreed to leave Deianira's hand in marriage to the man who had proven, once again, that patience and strength together could outlast almost any transformation thrown against them. Hercules and Deianira settled together for a time, building a life not unlike the one he had once built with Megara so many years before. Quiet mornings, small children filling their home again with noise and warmth, ordinary domestic happiness earned slowly after such an extraordinarily difficult stretch of years. It did not last without complication, the way few long lives in these old stories ever do. While travelling together some time later, the couple came to a river they needed to cross, and a centaur named Nessus, who worked as a ferryman at that particular crossing, offered to carry Deianira safely across the water on his back, while Hercules swam the distance himself. Partway across, Nessus, moved by a desire that had nothing honourable behind it, attempted to carry Deianira away entirely, rather than delivering her safely to the far bank. Hercules, seeing the betrayal unfold from the water, drew his bow, the very same bow that had once challenged the sun itself in the deserts of Libya, and loosed an arrow, one of the arrows he had long ago dipped in the poisonous blood of the Hydra, striking Nessus and bringing him down before any further harm could come to Deianira. As the centaur lay dying on the riverbank, poison already working its way through him, he spoke quietly to Deianira, offering her what he claimed was a final gift of gratitude despite everything, a portion of his own blood, mixed with the poison now inside him, which he told her could be used, if she ever feared Hercules' love for her fading, as a charm to restore his devotion completely. It was, of course, nothing of the kind, a final act of cruelty disguised as a parting kindness. Poison wrapped in the appearance of a gift, the last unkind trick of a dying creature who had lost everything and wanted, in his final moments, to leave behind one more piece of harm in the world. Deianira, not knowing any of this, and trusting the words of a dying stranger more than she perhaps should have, quietly kept that small vial of blood tucked away and forgotten for years, waiting, the way certain quiet mistakes so often do, for exactly the wrong moment to resurface. That moment, sadly, would eventually come, but it lay still some years ahead of the family in this part of the story, and in the meantime, Hercules and Deianira lived on together, through ordinary years filled with ordinary joys and ordinary troubles, children growing, seasons turning, a household settling into the same unremarkable rhythm that most long marriages eventually find. If your own mind is settling into a similarly unremarkable, comfortable rhythm right now, heavy-limbed, slow-thoughted, sinking gently towards sleep, let it. There is still more of this story ahead, but none of it needs to be followed closely from here. Let it become background now. The way a familiar voice in another room becomes background, once you have stopped needing to listen to every word of it. Let's return for a while to that voyage aboard the Argo, the one we passed through quickly earlier tonight, because it deserves a slower telling, the way a good long journey always does. When Jason first gathered his crew for the quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece, he sought out the very best of Greece's heroes, and Hercules, already carrying a growing reputation even before his 12 labours had begun, was among the very first he asked. The Argo itself was said to be the finest ship built up to that point in the world, its prow carved from wood, taken from a sacred oak at Dodona, said to speak sometimes with a voice of its own, offering warnings and guidance to the crew when the sea grew dangerous or the path forward grew uncertain. The journey east, toward the distant kingdom of Colchis where the fleece was kept, carried the Argo and her crew through island after island, each one holding its own strange encounter, its own small trial. There were storms that tested the ship's hull and the crew's nerve in equal measure, long stretches of calm water where the oars had to carry them forward through sheer physical effort, hour after unhurried hour, the rhythmic dip and pull of dozens of oars moving in patient unison, a sound not unlike a slow, steady heartbeat carrying the whole ship forward across water, so still it mirrored the sky above it, almost perfectly. It was on the coast of Mysia. During a stop to gather fresh water and repair a broken oar, that beast took its sad turn for Hercules specifically. His young companion Hylas, sent to fetch water from a nearby spring, was seen by the water nymphs who lived there, and so struck by his beauty that they drew him gently down beneath the surface to live among them forever, the water closing over him without any struggle, without any cry loud enough to carry back to the ship. Hercules, realizing Hylas had not returned, searched the surrounding forest for him through the entire remaining daylight and long into the night, calling his name again and again into trees that offered no answer back, refusing to give up even as the rest of the crew grew anxious to continue their voyage before the winds shifted. By morning, the Argo had sailed on without him, whether by a crew grown impatient or by the will of the gods, steering the story toward the labours still waiting for him back in Greece. The old tellings disagree, but Hercules remained behind on that quiet shore a while longer, searching still, before eventually turning back toward home alone, carrying with him one more small grief folded into a life that would, before long, hold so many more, It is a gentle, sad little detour in the larger shape of his story, easy to overlook next to lions and hydras and golden apples, but worth sitting with for a moment. The image of a strong, weary man calling a friend into a dark and unanswering forest, unwilling to simply let him go. Let's return once more to that river crossing where Hercules first won Deianira's hand, because it deserves a slower telling than we gave it earlier, the way the best old stories usually do. Achilles, the river god competing against him, was no ordinary rival. He was one of the oldest river gods in all of Greek mythology, said to be the source, in some tellings, of every freshwater spring and river across the entire known world, ancient enough that even the other gods treated him with a certain wary respect. When he first appeared to compete for Deianira's hand, he came not in his usual watery form, but as a man, broad and imposing. Though even in that shape there was something unsettled and shifting about him, the way water always seems to hold its true form only reluctantly. Their first contest was a simple wrestling match, human strength against human strength, and here Hercules found himself, for once, matched fairly evenly against an opponent who did not immediately yield the way so many of his labour's monsters eventually had. Achilles, sensing the fight slipping away from him, shifted suddenly into a serpent, hoping to slither free of Hercules' grip entirely, coiling and twisting against hands that had, after all, first learned their patient strength on two serpents sent to an infant's cradle many years before. Hercules laughed, it is said, at the transformation, remarking that strangling snakes was hardly a new challenge for him, and held on regardless until Achilles, growing desperate, shifted again, this time into a great bull, lowering his horns and charging with all the raw animal force that shape could offer. It was in this final form that Hercules finally gained the advantage he needed, seizing one of the bull's horns and wrestling the creature down into the dust of the riverbank, bending the horn back with such force that it snapped away entirely from Achilles' head. Defeated and humbled, the ancient river god finally yielded, transforming back into his more human shape, cradling the wound where his horn had been, and conceding Deianira's hand to the man who had outlasted every shape he tried to escape into. In some tellings, Achilles later traded a horn of plenty, endlessly overflowing with fruit and grain, in exchange for the return of his own broken horn, a small, quiet peace made between two old rivals once the contest itself was finally settled. It is worth noticing, drifting as you likely are by now, how often this exact shape repeats itself across Hercules' entire story, an opponent trying desperately to transform into something new, something harder to hold on to, and Hercules, patient as ever, simply refusing to let go through every single shift until the transformations themselves run out and only stillness remains. Nereus tried it in the search for the golden apples. Achilles tried it here, on the banks of a quiet river. And perhaps, in its own gentle way, sleep itself asks something similar of a restless mind tonight, not to fight against every shifting worry that rises up before it settles, but simply to hold on, patiently, unhurried, until the shifting finally stops on its own and only stillness remains. There's another chapter of his later years' worth, including here, one we passed over quickly before, involving a period of servitude almost as strange, in its own way, as the 12 labours themselves. After a certain transgression, some tellings say the killing of a guest under circumstances the gods judged unforgivable regardless of the reasons behind it, Hercules was sentenced by the oracle to serve, for a full year, as a slave to Omphale, Queen of Lydia, a punishment meant to humble him the same way his earlier service to Eurystheus had once been meant to test him. Life in Omphale's court unfolded very differently from the dangerous, monster-filled years of the 12 labours. Rather than lions and hydras, Hercules found himself set to quieter, more domestic tasks, and in some of the more playful old tellings, Omphale and Hercules are said to have exchanged roles entirely for a time, the queen draping herself in his lion's pelt and carrying his great club, while Hercules, in turn, sat among her attendants dressed in soft, fine fabrics, spinning wool and thread the way the queen's own household servants did every ordinary day. It is a strange, almost tender image to hold on to. The strongest man in the ancient world, patient hands that had once strangled serpents and wrestled bulls, now turning a spindle slowly in a quiet room, thread gathering loosely around it, hour after unhurried hour, an entirely different kind of labour than any he had faced before, but a labour all the same, undertaken with the same quiet patience he had carried through every other trial across his long life. Some storytellers read this chapter as pure humiliation, a hero stripped of his usual strength and dressed instead in the soft clothing of servitude. But there is another way to hold this same image, gentler and perhaps truer to the spirit of a story that has always, underneath its monsters, been about endurance rather than glory. A year of quiet, ordinary tasks, spinning thread instead of wrestling lions, may have offered Hercules something his earlier labours never could, an actual rest, disguised as punishment. A year where nothing hunted him and nothing needed defeating, only patient, repetitive, gentle work, done slowly, one thread at a time, in a warm room far from any cave or marsh or mountain. Perhaps that is worth carrying with you now too, into whatever rest waits for you tonight. Not every difficult chapter of a life is actually as difficult as it first appears from the outside. Sometimes what looks like humiliation or punishment or a step backward is quietly, secretly, exactly the kind of rest a tired person actually needed all along, even if they never would have chosen it for themselves. Years passed, quiet and mostly unremarkable, until a dispute arose, as disputes so often do, even in the calmest of lives, between Hercules and a king named Eurytus, who had once promised his daughter's hand in marriage to whoever could defeat him in an archery contest. Hercules had won that contest fairly, years before, only to be denied the bride he had rightfully earned, a small old grievance that eventually flared back into open conflict, ending with Hercules leading an assault against Eurytus' city, and, in the aftermath, taking the king's daughter, a young woman named Iole, back with him as part of the spoils of that victory. Word of this reached Deianira before Hercules himself returned home, carried by messengers moving faster than the man they described, and it settled over her not as simple news, but as a slow creeping fear, the old worry that had lived quietly in the back of her mind for years now, that her husband's affection might someday fade, or worse, be pulled somewhere else entirely. It was in this state of quiet, private worry that she remembered the small vial Nessus had given her so long ago beside that river crossing, tucked away and nearly forgotten through years of ordinary domestic life. Believing it to be exactly what the dying centaur had claimed, a charm to preserve her husband's love rather than the poison it truly was, Deianira took a fine, freshly woven shirt and worked the tainted blood carefully into its fabric before sending it to Hercules as a loving gift. A small, quiet gesture meant only to protect a marriage she feared was slipping away from her, never once imagining the harm folded invisibly into every thread. Hercules received the shirt and, suspecting nothing, put it on to perform a sacrifice to the gods, a simple, ordinary act of devotion he had performed countless times before across his long life. But as the warmth of the sacrificial fire spread through the fabric, the poison hidden within it began to activate, burning not outwardly, where it might have been seen and stopped in time, but inward, deep into his skin, fusing the fabric to his body with a pain unlike anything even a man who had wrestled lions and wrestled bulls and held the entire sky upon his own shoulders had ever experienced before. He tried to tear the shirt away, and found that tearing it only tore his own flesh along with it, the poison having bound itself so completely to him that no amount of strength, the very strength that had carried him through 12 impossible labours, could undo the damage now spreading through his body. When word reached Deianira of what her gift had truly done, the horror of her mistake settled over her all at once. understanding too late that the dying centaur's final words beside that river had been nothing but one last act of cruelty, a poison disguised so carefully as love that she had carried it, unknowingly, in her own home for years. Unable to bear what she had unintentionally caused, she took her own life shortly after, leaving Hercules to face the end of his own long story, not only in physical agony, but in a grief that must have felt, in some ways, heavier even than the pain of the poison itself, knowing that the wound would not heal, and that no labour, no strength, no patience could carry him through this particular trial, the way it had carried him through every trial before it. Hercules asked to be carried to the top of Mount Oeta, where he instructed his companions to build a great funeral pyre, gathering wood and stacking it high, so that he might end his suffering on his own terms, rather than continuing to endure a pain that had no cure and no end in sight. It is said that none of his companions could bring themselves to actually light the pyre once it was built, unwilling to be the one responsible for ending the life of a man they had followed and admired for so long, until finally a young man named Philoctetes, or in some tellings his father Poeas, agreed to do it, and was rewarded for that difficult mercy with Hercules' own bow and his quiver of arrows, the same bow that had once threatened the sun itself in the deserts of Libya, the same arrows dipped so long ago in the poisonous blood of the Hydra, a poison that, in a strange and heavy circle closing on itself, had ultimately found its way back to end the very life of the man who first collected it. As the flames rose around him on that quiet mountaintop, something extraordinary happened. Something that lifts this final chapter of Hercules' story out of simple tragedy and into something closer to peace. It is said that Zeus himself, watching from Olympus, could not bear to let his mortal son's life end there in pain and fire alone, and so, as the flames consumed everything mortal about him, Zeus drew the immortal part of Hercules, the part inherited directly from his divine father, up out of the smoke and flame entirely, lifting him gently away from Mount Oeta and up into the sky itself, toward Olympus, where the gods themselves welcomed him, finally fully as one of their own, even Hera, whose long patient anger had shaped nearly every hardship in his entire life, from the 2 serpents sent to his cradle to the many trials that followed, is said to have finally set that anger aside once he arrived among the gods, reconciling with him at last, and in some of the old gentler tellings, even offering her own daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, to him in marriage, a quiet, unexpected peace, settling over a relationship that had never once been peaceful across his entire mortal life. Hercules became, at the very end of this long story, not merely a hero remembered in songs and carvings, but a god himself, granted immortality, granted rest, granted, finally, after 12 impossible labours and a lifetime of struggle before and after them, an ending that did not simply stop, but instead lifted upward, gently, into something lasting far beyond the mountain, and the fire, and the pain that had brought him there. There's one more small, human detail worth adding, before we let this story rest completely. Something about the way Hercules himself was remembered, not just as a distant, superhuman figure, but as someone with genuine warmth, even humour, running underneath all that strength. Ancient plays and comedies, written centuries after his labours were first imagined, often portrayed him as good-natured and food-loving, a hero who could just as easily be found enjoying a hearty meal and a cup of wine among friends as he could be found wrestling a lion in total darkness. There is something comforting in that detail, a reminder that even a figure remembered mostly for enormous monster-filled labours was also, underneath it all, simply a person who liked good company and simple pleasures and the particular contentment of a full stomach after a long day's work. He was known, in many tellings, for his enormous appetite, capable of eating and drinking more than several ordinary men combined, a trait that became something of a running, affectionate joke across many later retellings of his story, hosts nervously wondering if the stores of food and wine would survive a single visit from him. Farmers half laughing, half worrying at how much a demigod's hospitality might actually cost them. It softens the larger legend somehow to imagine him this way, not only as the solemn hero enduring 12 impossible trials, but as a genuinely warm presence at any table he sat down at, quick to laugh, generous with his own stories, someone people were glad to have stopped by. Even if it meant refilling his cup rather more often than they'd originally planned. Perhaps that too is worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight, the reminder that even the heaviest, most difficult chapters of any long life usually sit right alongside smaller, warmer ones. Meals shared, laughter offered, ordinary human comfort tucked in between the labours and the grief, and the long tired roads. Hercules' story has never really been only about strength. It has always, underneath everything else, been about a person, warm and flawed and generous and occasionally very hungry, simply doing his best to carry an unbearably heavy life all the way through to its end, the same as anyone else ever has. It's worth remembering, too, as this story finally winds down, that Hercules himself was never actually known by that name in the language his own story was first told in. Heracles, meaning something close to glory of Hera, was his original Greek name, a strange and almost bitter irony given how much of his suffering that same goddess personally caused across his entire life. It was only later, when Roman writers adapted these Greek myths into their own language and their own religious traditions, that the name shifted into the Latin form we still use most often today, Hercules. The name carved onto temples across the Roman world, the name that eventually travelled forward through centuries of translation into the English you're hearing tonight. There is something almost poetic in that particular irony. A hero named, quite literally, for the glory of the very goddess, who spent his entire life trying to destroy him, and who, in the end, only reconciled with him once his suffering had finally fully run its course. Perhaps his name was less a cruel joke than a kind of quiet prophecy all along. Glory of Hera not because she gave it freely, but because everything he endured on account of her anger eventually became the very glory his name still carries, thousands of years later, into rooms exactly like the one you're resting in right now. Let that be one of the last small threads of this story to settle over you, a name carrying an entire lifetime of hardship folded quietly inside it, and glory, hard-earned and lasting, folded in right alongside it. Rest well tonight, carrying nothing but the soft, settled weight of a very long story, finally completely finished. On clear nights, even now, thousands of years after that fire on Mount Oeta finally burned itself out, you can still find Hercules if you know where to look. The Greeks placed him among the stars, a great kneeling figure stretched across the northern sky, one of the largest constellations we can still trace tonight, quietly turning overhead the same way it has turned overhead for every single night since. There is something worth sitting with in that image for a moment. A man who spent nearly his entire mortal life being tested, being doubted, being sent from one impossible task to the next by a king, too afraid to even stand in the same room as him ending up, finally, simply resting among the stars, no more labours left to complete. Nothing left to prove to anyone, just a quiet shape in the dark sky that people have looked up at, generation after generation, and found a strange kind of comfort in. Temples were built to him across the ancient world, not only in Greece but eventually across the wider Mediterranean, in Italy, in Spain, in cities that would later become part of the Roman world, where he was worshipped under the name Hercules rather than his older Greek name Heracles. Sailors prayed to him before difficult voyages. Travellers invoked his name at crossroads, remembering, perhaps, that old story of the young Hercules standing at his own crossroads and choosing the harder path over the easier one. Wrestlers and athletes considered him a patron of their sport, remembering that so many of his greatest victories, the lion, the bull, Cerberus himself, were won not with a weapon at all, but simply through the strength of his own body and the patience of his own will. It is worth pausing here, now, drifting as you likely are somewhere between this quiet story and true sleep, to think for a moment about what made Hercules' story last so long in the memory of people who came after him. Thousands of years of storytellers choosing, again and again, to keep his labours alive around their fires, in their temples, on their pottery, in the very stars themselves. It was never really about the monsters. A lion, however impossible to wound, is still just a lion. A river, however difficult to redirect, is still just a river. What made his story worth telling, over and over across so many centuries, was the shape underneath all of it. A man handed one impossible task after another, and simply, patiently, without giving up, finding his way through each one, not through anger, not through desperation, but through steady, unglamorous endurance, the kind that rarely makes for an exciting single moment, but that adds up slowly into something that outlasts everything else. Maybe that is part of why a story like this one settles so easily into the quiet hours before sleep. Because most of what any of us actually carries through our own days is not dramatic either. It is not usually a lion in a cave or a many-headed serpent in a marsh. It is the smaller, quieter weight of ordinary difficulty, a long day, an unresolved worry, a task that keeps growing the closer you think you are to finishing it. The same way Hercules' own count of labours kept quietly stretching from 10 toward 12. And maybe, in some small way, letting a story like this one carry you towards sleep tonight is its own quiet kind of labour completed. One more difficult day finally set down, the way Atlas set down the sky, if only for a little while. If you are the kind of person who has found yourself, more nights than you'd like to admit, lying awake with your mind still moving through everything left undone, tomorrow's tasks stacking up in the dark, the way King Eurystheus once stacked labour after labour onto a man who had already given so much, know that you are not alone in that particular kind of tiredness. It is one of the most common things people write in the comments here on Boring History Narrative, a quiet admission that the mind simply will not slow down on its own, that it needs something else, something slow and steady and unhurried like this story, to finally loosen its grip. If that has been true for you tonight, let it keep being true for just a little while longer. There is no need to hold on to anything else from this story now. Let it become soft and distant, a low hum in the background, while we move, gently, toward the very end of this long night together. Let's linger, just a little longer, on that image of the constellation itself, because it holds more detail than most people ever pause to notice. The figure the Greeks traced among those stars is shown kneeling, one foot planted forward, an arm raised as if mid-motion, frozen in whatever gesture the ancient stargazers imagined for him. Some say striking a final blow, others say simply reaching upward, toward the very sky he once held briefly on borrowed shoulders. It is one of the largest constellations in the entire night sky, sprawling and faint, made up of stars dim enough that finding its full shape takes real patience, the kind of patience that feels entirely fitting for a hero whose whole story was built on exactly that quality. Astronomers, in the centuries since, have charted it carefully, named its brightest stars, mapped its exact position against the slow turning of the seasons, and yet none of that careful science has ever quite replaced the older, simpler comfort of just looking up on a clear night and knowing somewhere in that vast scattering of light an old tired hero is still resting, exactly where he was placed so long ago, watching nothing in particular, asking nothing of anyone below him, simply present, the way he has been present for every single night since. That is where we'll leave him now, and where we'll leave this story too, resting quietly overhead, unhurried, complete, and entirely at peace. Let's add one final piece to this story before we let it rest completely. A quiet look at how Hercules' legend eventually made its way into the hands of Renaissance painters and sculptors. Thousands of years after those first ancient poets carried the tale from fireside to fireside. Long after Rome itself had fallen, and the old temples built in his honour had crumbled into quiet ruins overgrown with grass and wildflowers, artists across Italy and beyond rediscovered his story with a kind of fresh, careful reverence, carving his likeness into marble all over again, painting his 12 labours across the ceilings of palaces and the walls of grand halls, choosing him again and again as a subject worthy of their most careful, patient work. There is a famous marble sculpture, still standing today in a museum in Naples, of Hercules leaning wearily on his club after completing his labours, his enormous muscled body slightly slumped, his face carrying an expression of exhaustion rather than triumph, a choice that feels, even now, remarkably tender for a figure so often reduced to nothing but raw strength. The sculptor who carved that particular piece understood something essential about this story that easily gets lost beneath the lions and the hydras, that the truest, most human moment in this entire tale was never the fighting itself, but the tiredness that came after it, the quiet, heavy relief of finally being allowed to rest once every labour was finished. That same tiredness, earned and complete, is exactly what this story has been walking you toward all night long. 12 labours behind you now, in a sense, 12 long chapters of an ancient story finally heard all the way through, and nothing left now except the same quiet permission that ancient sculptor once carved so carefully into cold marble centuries ago, permission to lean, finally, fully, into rest. It's worth knowing, drifting as you likely are by now, that the story you've been listening to tonight was never really owned by just one culture. The way we might assume a myth belongs permanently to the people who first told it. Long before the Romans ever wrote their own versions of these labours, giving Hercules the Latin name history would eventually remember him by, the Phoenicians already told stories of their own god Melkart, a figure so similar in shape and strength that Greek travellers meeting Phoenician sailors along the Mediterranean coast simply assumed they were hearing about the same hero under a different name entirely. The Etruscans, in the hills of what is now Italy, carved his image onto mirrors and tomb walls centuries before Rome itself grew into an empire, calling him Hercule, wrestling the same lion, carrying the same club, wearing the same lion's pelt across his shoulders. When Rome eventually rose to prominence and absorbed so much of Greek mythology into its own religious life, Hercules did not simply get renamed and left otherwise untouched. Roman generals built temples to him near their trade routes and their cattle markets, considering him a patron of merchants and travellers as much as a hero of impossible labours, a quieter, more practical kind of worship than the dramatic myths might suggest. Ordinary people simply asking a familiar god to watch over an ordinary journey. There is something almost comforting in that detail, if you let it settle over you for a moment, that underneath all the lions and hydras and golden apples, so much of what people actually wanted from Hercules across so many centuries and so many different cultures was something quite small and human: safe travels, a good harvest, protection over the ordinary uncertainties of ordinary days. Not so different, really, from what any of us might quietly wish for on an uncertain day of our own. Let's use that same feeling, that quiet, practical comfort, to settle a little further into rest now. Bring your attention, gently, to your feet, wherever they happen to be resting beneath the blankets right now, and let them grow soft and heavy. The same unhurried heaviness that settled over Atlas's shoulders once he finally set the sky back down. Let that heaviness move slowly upward, into your calves, into your knees, into your thighs, each part of you settling a little further into stillness, the way a long, difficult labour finally settles into rest once it's been completed. There is nothing left to carry right now, nothing left to prove to anyone. Tonight there's one more quiet thread of this story worth following before we let it close completely, and it has to do with Hercules' own children, because his story, in the end, did not stop with him. Through his years of wandering and his 2 marriages, he fathered many children across many different mothers, and in later Greek tradition, entire ruling families and even whole regions of Greece traced their lineage back to him, calling themselves the Heraclidae, the children of Hercules, a lineage claimed with pride for hundreds of years after his own life had ended. There is something quietly moving in that, a man who spent so much of his life being tested, being doubted, being sent from one impossible task to another by a king who could barely stand to look at him, becoming, eventually, not just a hero remembered, but an ancestor claimed, a beginning rather than only an ending, entire family lines stretching forward from him, the way his own story had once stretched backward from a single strange night in Thebes, when a god disguised himself to look like someone else entirely. Even the difficult chapters of his life, the grief, the madness, the poisoned shirt he never should have had to wear, became part of what people admired about him, rather than parts they quietly left out of the story. That is perhaps one of the gentler lessons tucked into a myth that otherwise seems on its surface to be mostly about lions and hydras and enormous impossible strength. A whole life, even one carrying that much hardship inside it, can still add up to something worth remembering fondly, worth naming children and cities and constellations after, worth returning to, story after story, for thousands of years afterward. Whatever hardship you might be carrying quietly into sleep with you tonight, know that it does not have to be the only thing that eventually gets remembered about the life holding it. There is always more ahead, even when a particular chapter feels unbearably heavy while you're standing inside it. Let your breathing settle a little further now. In slowly for a count of 4. Held gently for a count of 4. Out longer and slower still for a count of 6. There is nothing more this story is going to ask you to follow closely from here. Just the sound of a voice, low and unhurried, and the quiet, settled feeling of a very long story finally, gently coming to its rest. It's a strange kind of immortality, when you think about it slowly enough, the way a hero's name can outlive not just his own body, but the entire civilization that first told his story. Long after the temples built to Hercules crumbled into quiet piles of stone, long after the last priest who ever poured a sacrifice in his name had been forgotten, his name kept living anyway, tucked quietly into the corners of languages that didn't even exist yet when he was first imagined beside a fire in ancient Thebes. You have probably used his name yourself, more than once, without even thinking about where it came from. Anytime something feels almost impossibly difficult, a task at work that keeps growing the longer you look at it, a home renovation that seems to multiply new problems the same way the Hydra multiplied new heads, you might call it Herculean, without ever pausing to remember that the word is quietly, directly. Borrowing the name of a tired man who once wrestled a lion in total darkness because arrows alone weren't enough. Gyms are named after him. Protein powders borrow his silhouette. Statues of him, broad-shouldered, leaning on his club, the lion's pelt draped loosely over one arm, stand in museum halls and city squares across the world, still quietly reminding anyone who walks past that strength, real strength, was never really about how loud a single moment of it looked, but about how long a person could keep going after the moment had already worn them down. There is a reason his story has resonated so particularly with people far from Greece, in places he never could have imagined his name travelling to, including, now, wherever you happen to be lying tonight. It is the same reason so many modern stories about grit and endurance, and quietly getting back up after being knocked down, borrow, whether they know it or not, from the same old shape his story first carved out thousands of years ago. A person handed a task too big for them. A person who does not get to choose the task, only how they respond to it. A person who fails sometimes, grieves sometimes, gets tricked sometimes by a titan who doesn't want his sky back, and who keeps going anyway, one labour at a time, because the alternative, giving up entirely, was never really something his story allowed him to consider. Maybe that's part of why it feels so natural to let a story like this one carry you towards sleep after a long day of your own. Not because your day involved lions or serpents or a sky pressing down on your shoulders, but because it likely involved its own smaller version of the same shape. Tasks that felt too big in the morning and only slightly smaller by evening. A patience that had to be found somewhere, even when it didn't feel like there was much patience left. If you made it through today, even the difficult parts, even the parts that felt like they multiplied the harder you fought them, you already understand something Hercules understood a very long time ago. That most of the hardest things in a life are not won in a single dramatic moment, but simply outlasted slowly, one quiet hour at a time, the same unhurried way this story has been moving all night long. Let's take a moment now to imagine how this whole story would have first travelled, mouth to mouth, fire to fire, long before anyone ever wrote a single word of it down. In the earliest centuries after these events were first imagined, there was no book to preserve them, no single fixed version anyone could point to as the true and final telling. Instead, there were singers, wandering poets called rhapsodes, who travelled from town to town across the Greek world, carrying these stories the way a travelling merchant might carry goods, trading a telling of the Nemean Lion for a warm meal and a place to sleep, offering the golden apples of the Hesperides to a room full of strangers gathered close around a fire on a cold night. Each performance a little different from the last, shaped by the mood of the room, the season, the particular audience gathered to listen. It is easy to imagine one of those long ago nights now. A small stone room somewhere in the Greek countryside, a fire burning low in the centre of it, smoke curling up toward a hole in the roof. A dozen or more tired travellers and villagers gathered close around the warmth, and a single poet, weathered and unhurried, beginning the same story you have been listening to tonight. A night stretched 3 times its normal length, an infant reaching calmly for 2 serpents in his cradle. The listeners in that ancient room would have leaned in exactly the way you might be leaning into this story now, tired from a long day's work, grateful for a voice that asked nothing of them except to simply listen and to let their minds drift wherever the story carried them, towards sleep most nights, exactly the way it is carrying you tonight. These stories changed slowly across the centuries of that oral telling, before they were ever finally written down by poets like Apollodorus and other later chroniclers, who gathered the scattered versions into something closer to the shape we know today. Details shifted from town to town. Some tellers emphasized the grief, others the glory. Some lingered longer on the 12 labours, while others rushed through them to spend more time on his final years with Deianira. There was never one single correct version, only countless warm, flickering retellings, each one slightly different, each one true in its own way. The same story reborn 1,000 times across 1,000 different firesides, before it ever reached the version being told to you now, in an entirely different language, in an entirely different century, through a screen rather than a flickering fire, but carrying underneath all of that difference the exact same quiet purpose it always has, a voice unhurried and warm, easing a tired listener gently toward rest. Between each of the 12 labours, though the old stories rarely dwell on it, there would have been long stretches of ordinary travel, the kind of unremarkable, repetitive movement that never makes it into the exciting parts of any legend, but that must have made up the actual majority of Hercules' days during those years of service. Walking, mostly. Long dusty roads between one kingdom and the next, sandals worn thin against stone and packed earth, the sun rising and setting again and again over unfamiliar hills, small villages passed through and left behind. Innkeepers and farmers and travellers, along the way, who had no idea, most of them, that the broad-shouldered stranger passing quietly through their town had already wrestled a lion in total darkness. or would soon be diverting entire rivers through a king's neglected stables. Imagine, for a moment, one of those ordinary travel nights, tucked somewhere between the Hydra's marsh and the golden-antlered hind's long chase. Hercules making camp alone beneath an open addic, a small fire built from gathered branches, its light flickering low and orange against the surrounding dark, smoke curling upward into a night thick with stars. The same stars that would, centuries later, hold his own shape among them. There would have been the sound of insects trading their slow, steady rhythm through the grass. The occasional distant call of some night bird, unseen, somewhere beyond the firelight's reach. The particular stillness of a person completely alone in the world. No king waiting to assign the next impossible task until morning. No monster yet identified in the darkness ahead. Just a fire and a sky, and the quiet, tired weight of a body finally allowed to simply rest for a few hours before continuing on. It is easy. Listening to a story built almost entirely around dramatic confrontations, lions and serpents and wild bulls and monstrous hounds, to forget how much of any long, difficult undertaking is actually made of these quieter, uneventful stretches, the walking between the fighting, the waiting between the walking, the simple, unglamorous accumulation of one ordinary hour after another, until eventually, enough of them have passed that something impossible has quietly become finished. Perhaps that is the truest, most useful shape of this entire story to carry with you into your own sleep tonight. Not the lion, not the Hydra, not even the sky held briefly on borrowed shoulders, but simply this, an enormous task, faced one long, unremarkable stretch of road at a time, one small fire built each night to rest beside, one morning after another, where the only real choice was simply to keep walking. If you have been carrying something heavy of your own through the ordinary stretches of your own recent days, something that hasn't required a dramatic battle so much as a slow, tired persistence, know that this too is exactly the kind of labour this old story was always quietly about. Not every hardship announces itself with a many-headed monster. Most of them look much more like a long road, walked patiently, one unremarkable step after another, until somehow, eventually, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, you look back and realise the distance behind you has grown very great indeed. Let your own body settle a little further now into that same kind of quiet. Unremarkable rest, no dramatic effort required, just the simple, patient accumulation of minutes passing, one after another, each one carrying you a little closer to sleep, the same unhurried way. Each of those long ancient roads once carried a tired hero a little closer to the end of his service. Let's stay a little longer inside the world this story has been built from, not following any particular event now, just resting inside the atmosphere of it. The way you might sit quietly in a warm room, long after the conversation in it has ended. Picture ancient Greece the way it existed in the time this story unfolded, not as it appears in bright museum reconstructions, but as it would have actually felt to stand inside. Dusty roads worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet, white stone buildings not yet weathered into the pale ruins we know today, but freshly cut, warm-coloured, catching the late afternoon sun in soft gold and ochre tones. Olive trees lined the hillsides in slow silvery rows, their leaves turning quietly in whatever breeze happened to move through the valley, and somewhere always, the distant sound of goat bells, or a shepherd's low call, or the creak of a cart, moving unhurried along a dirt road toward a market that had already mostly closed for the day. At night, and this story has always belonged more to the night than to the day, the sky over Greece would have been darker than almost any sky you have seen yourself. No distant glow of cities to wash out the stars, just an enormous, unbroken spread of them, thick enough in places to look almost like smoke, or mist, or a long pale river running quietly overhead. It is worth imagining for a moment what it might have felt like to lie back on a warm hillside on a night like that, the ground still holding a little of the day's heat beneath you, and to look up and actually be able to find him there. The great kneeling shape of Hercules stretched patiently across the northern sky, exactly where storytellers said he had been placed after that final fire on Mount Oeta finally burned itself down to embers. Somewhere below that same sky, in a modest stone house not so different from the one Alcmene once lived in, a family would have been settling in for the night, the same way families have settled in for the night in every single century since, lamps pinched out one at a time, a door checked and latched, children tucked beneath whatever blankets the season required, and somewhere among them, almost certainly, a grandparent, or a parent, or an older sibling, telling a story exactly like this one, slowly, unhurried, half remembered and half improvised, to ease the youngest ones towards sleep. This story you are listening to tonight is not really so different from that. It has travelled an extraordinarily long distance to reach you. Thousands of years, a different language entirely, a completely different kind of room than the one it was first told in, and yet the purpose has stayed exactly the same the entire way, a familiar voice, low and unhurried, carrying a tired mind gently toward rest. If you would like to return here tomorrow night, or whenever your own mind next refuses to slow down on its own, boring history narrative will have another story waiting. Another quiet corner of the ancient world to wander through together until sleep finds you. A subscription costs nothing at all, and it means you will never have to search for a story like this one when you need it most. For now, though, there is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do, except let this last stretch of the night carry you the rest of the way. For these last few minutes together, let's slow down even further, and let the rest of this story become less about following events, and more about simply resting inside them. Wherever you are lying right now, let your body settle a little heavier into the mattress beneath you. Feel the places where your body meets the bed, your heels, the backs of your legs, your shoulder blades, the back of your head, and let each of those points grow just a little heavier, a little looser, the way Hercules' own tired arms must have grown heavy after each long labour was finally finished. Picture, if you'd like, the quiet cave near Nemea, dark and cool and utterly silent, the kind of stillness that exists nowhere in the daytime world, only in places completely sealed away from light and sound. That is the kind of stillness we are settling into now. Let your eyelids rest the way that cave entrance was finally sealed, close gently, blocking out everything except quiet. If your thoughts drift toward tomorrow, toward some small task waiting for you, the way King Eurystheus was always waiting with one more labour, gently set that thought down, the way Hercules set down his weapons before entering the lion's den unarmed. You do not need any weapons for this part of the night. You only need to rest. Let your breath slow to match the unhurried pace of the Cerenean hind, wandering patiently across an entire turning year, never rushed, never frantic, simply moving forward season after season, toward wherever it was always going to end up. Breathe in slowly for a count of 4, hold that breath gently for a count of 4, and let it go, slowly, for a count of 6. Longer on the way out than it was on the way in, the same unhurried rhythm as a year, slowly turning toward its own quiet end. Feel your hands, wherever they are resting right now, growing loose and heavy, the way Hercules' own hands finally grew still after 12 impossible labours. No more lions to hold, no more serpents to grip, no more sky to carry on tired shoulders, just stillness, just rest. If your mind wanders back over pieces of this story, the golden lion pelt, the marsh full of hissing heads, the mountain buried in snow, the rivers bent gently to their new course, let those images move slowly, like scenery drifting past the window of a train at night, present, but no longer something you need to hold on to tightly. They can simply pass by. Feel your legs growing heavy now too. The same patient heaviness that must have settled into Atlas's own shoulders after holding up the entire sky for so many long uncounted years. But unlike Atlas, there is no burden resting on you right now. Nothing you need to hold up, nothing you need to carry any further tonight. You can simply let it all rest exactly where it is, your whole body sinking a little deeper into the bed, a little further from waking, a little closer to the kind of sleep that asks nothing else of you at all. Let's slow all the way down again now, the way we did earlier, and return to the body for a while, because a story this long deserves more than one quiet pause for rest along the way. Bring your attention gently to your shoulders, wherever they are resting right now against the bed beneath you. For most of us, shoulders carry more tension through an ordinary day than almost any other part of the body, tightening slowly, without our even noticing, around every small stress that passes through, an email that needed a careful reply, a conversation that didn't go quite the way you hoped, a long list of tomorrow's tasks quietly stacking themselves up somewhere in the back of your mind, the way King Eurystheus once quietly stacked one labour on top of another. Let your shoulders drop now just slightly, away from your ears the way Atlas's shoulders must have dropped, just slightly, in that single brief moment when Hercules took the sky's full weight from him. You do not need to hold anything up right now, nothing at all. Let that heaviness drain slowly down through your arms, into your elbows, into your wrists, into your hands, until your hands too feel completely loose and empty, holding nothing, gripping nothing. The way Hercules' own hands finally rested once every labour, every serpent, every lion, every impossible task had at last been set down for good. Move your attention now to your chest and to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath moving in and out beneath it. There is nothing you need to control about that breath right now. Let it simply happen on its own. The way a river moves on its own, once it has been given a clear channel to follow. The way the waters of the Alpheus and the Peneus once moved steadily through King Ogyges' stables, without any further effort required from the man who had redirected them there. In and out. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Just a slow, patient rhythm, carrying you, breath by breath, further from waking and closer to sleep. Let your attention drift down now into your stomach, your hips, the tops of your legs, each part growing heavier in turn. The same unhurried heaviness that settled over an entire flock of startled birds once they finally stopped struggling against the sky, and simply glided, exhausted, toward whatever quiet distance waited for them far from Lake Stymphalis. You are that tired now too, in the best possible way, heavy-limbed, unhurried, moving gently toward a rest that has been earned by an entire long day. The same way Hercules' own rest, when it finally came among the stars, was earned by an entire long, difficult life. Let your knees soften. Let your ankles soften. Let your feet, all the way down at the far end of you, finally stop carrying any weight at all. The way the golden-antlered hind, once finally caught, no longer needed to keep running across an entire turning year. There is nowhere left to run tonight. Nothing left to chase. Just this slow, heavy stillness, spreading gently through your entire body, one quiet breath at a time. Before we move fully into the final rest of this story, let's take one more quiet detour. This time to the harbour towns Hercules would have passed through on his way to and from so many of these distant labours, because the sea itself played such a constant quiet role across his entire life, carrying him toward the Amazons, toward the edge of the world for Gerion's cattle, alongside Jason's crew aboard the Argo, and eventually, in that strange golden cup borrowed from the sun itself, across the vast dark water toward the garden of the Hesperides. Picture one of those harbour evenings now, ships resting quietly at anchor, their hulls rocking gently against a tide that never fully stops moving even in the stillest weather, ropes creaking softly against wooden posts, the smell of salt and tar and drying fish nets hanging heavy in the cooling evening air. Sailors would have gathered near the shore as the light faded, mending nets, sharing quiet stories of their own, watching the horizon slowly darken from gold to deep blue to a black thick with stars. The same stars that would, centuries later, hold Hercules' own resting shape among them. It is the kind of unhurried evening that exists in nearly every century, in nearly every coastal town, sailors waiting for morning tides, the sea moving steadily beneath them the entire night through, patient and ancient and entirely unbothered by whatever labours or worries occupied the minds of the people resting temporarily along its shore. There is something about the sea, constant and rhythmic, that has always lent itself naturally to rest. The slow rise and fall of waves, not unlike the slow rise and fall of your own breath right now, in and out, unhurried, endless, asking nothing of you except to simply continue. Let that same rhythm carry you now. The way it once carried Hercules across so many long, uncertain voyages, toward Amazons and distant islands and gardens guarded by golden trees. You are not sailing toward any labour tonight. There is no king waiting anxiously on some distant shore for your return. Just the steady, patient rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling, carrying you gently, wave after quiet wave, the rest of the way towards sleep. Let's take one more slow walk through the world of ancient Greece before we finally let this story close for good. This time through the eyes of someone who might have actually watched Hercules pass through their own small corner of it. An ordinary farmer, perhaps, tending an olive grove on a warm afternoon, looking up from his work to see an unusually large, broad-shouldered stranger walking steadily along the road below, a lion's pelt draped over one shoulder, a great wooden club resting easily against the other, moving with the unhurried, purposeful pace of someone who has walked a very great distance already and expects to walk a great deal further still before nightfall. That farmer would not have known, most likely, exactly which labour this stranger was travelling toward, whether it was a marsh full of hissing serpent heads waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, or a distant mountain buried in snow, or a ship waiting at some far harbour to carry him toward the very edge of the world. He would only have seen what was actually in front of him, a tired, dusty traveller passing through an ordinary afternoon, perhaps pausing briefly at the well to drink, perhaps exchanging a few quiet words about the weather, or the harvest, or the state of the roads further along, before continuing on his way, disappearing slowly around a bend, leaving behind nothing more than a faint trail of dust settling back down over the road. It is worth imagining that ordinary farmer's version of this story for a moment, because it strips away, briefly, all the drama and mythology we already know, and leaves behind something much smaller and much more human, simply one tired traveller, passing briefly through another person's ordinary day, neither of them fully aware of the enormous weight the other might be carrying underneath such an unremarkable surface. Perhaps someone passed briefly through your own day-to-day in exactly that same way, carrying quietly some labour or grief or long road of their own that you never had any way of seeing, the same way that farmer never fully understood the weight resting on the shoulders of the stranger, who paused briefly at his, well before walking on. Let that quiet, gentle thought settle over you now. One last small piece of this long story to carry with you into sleep, that every ordinary face passing briefly through your own life might be carrying its own unseen labours, its own unseen grief, its own long road walked patiently towards some distant, uncertain end, and that somewhere tonight your own rest, quiet and complete, is exactly the kind of ending this whole long story has been slowly, gently, walking you toward. There is one final thread worth gathering up before we close this story completely. A small circle worth noticing now that the whole shape of Hercules' life has been laid out in front of us. He began his story being tested by Hera, a goddess whose anger he never earned and never fully understood, forced into danger after danger simply because of who his father happened to be. And he ended his story reconciled with that same goddess, welcomed finally among the very gods who had, for so much of his mortal life, watched his suffering from a careful distance. It is a rare kind of ending for a story built on so much hardship, not vengeance, not lingering bitterness, but a quiet, eventual peace between two figures who had spent an entire lifetime, in their own very different ways, simply trying to endure each other. There is something worth holding on to in that particular circle, closing so gently at the very end of such a long and difficult road. Whatever hardship shaped the beginning of a story, whatever unfair test or unearned burden set someone on a road they never would have chosen for themselves, does not have to be the same shape the story ends in. Hercules' own road began with two serpents sent into his cradle by a goddess who wished him harm, and it ended among the stars, married into the very family of that same goddess. The anger that once defined the whole shape of his life finally, quietly set down. If the beginning of your own day, or week, or year carried its own difficult, unfair weight, know that the ending does not have to match it. Stories change shape as they go. Yours can too, and with that we finally reach the true end of tonight's story. 12 labours completed. A lifetime of hardship carried patiently through to its close. A quiet reconciliation among the stars, where Hercules still rests tonight, turning slowly overhead, watching over absolutely nothing in particular, except, perhaps, in his own small, ancient way, over you, before we truly close this story for the night. Let's take one more unhurried look backward, across everything this long journey has actually covered, not to remember it in detail, but simply to appreciate for a moment how much distance a single story can travel when it's given enough time and enough patience to unfold properly. We began in a small stone house in Thebes, on a night stretched 3 times its natural length. We travelled through a childhood spent quietly among shepherds, a crossroads where a difficult choice was made freely. A marriage built, and then, through no fault of the man who built it, lost entirely to a madness sent from above. We climbed a mountain to an oracle who offered no comfort, only a long road forward, and then we walked that road ourselves. Labour by labour, across marshes and mountains, deserts and rivers, all the way to the edge of the known world and back, and finally down into the deepest, quietest darkness the ancient world could imagine, and safely back out of it again. We watched a second family built, slowly and carefully, out of nothing but time and patience, only to lose it too, not to a goddess's anger this time, but to a small, terrible mistake made entirely out of love. We climbed one final mountain, watched a fire lit that no one wanted to light, and then watched that fire lift something upward instead of simply ending it, carrying a tired mortal life up into an immortal rest among the very stars that still turn overhead tonight. And now, after all of that distance, after 12 labours and a lifetime of hardship, carried patiently through to its close, we have arrived here, together, at the exact quiet stillness this entire story was always slowly walking toward. There is nothing left now but rest, complete and well-earned, for Hercules, resting among his stars, and for you too, resting exactly where you are, the whole long distance of this story, finally gently behind you. If you drifted off somewhere earlier in this story, and you are only half hearing these words now, let's walk back through it one more time, softly, slowly. The way you might flip back through the pages of a familiar book, without really reading them, just enough to remember the shape of the story before letting it close again. It began with a night stretched 3 times its normal length, a queen of heaven watching from far above, and 2 serpents sent quietly into a nursery where an infant reached out and simply held on until the danger passed. It moved through a childhood among shepherds, a crossroads where a young man chose the harder of 2 roads, a marriage, a family, and then a grief too heavy to describe, carried up a mountain to an oracle who offered no comfort, only a long road of service as the only way through it. Then came the labours, one after another, a lion faced in total darkness, and worn afterward as a golden pelt, a serpent that grew new heads for every one that was cut away, until fire finally sealed each wound before it could multiply again. A golden antlered deer chased patiently across an entire turning year, a mountain boar driven gently into deep snow, a river bent from its course to wash away years of neglect in a single afternoon. A flock of bronze-feathered birds startled up into open sky by nothing more than a borrowed noise. A wild bull wrestled calm on a dry hillside. A herd of terrible mares finally settled. A belt given freely, and a grief that followed a lie no one meant to believe. A herd of red cattle driven home across the entire width of the known world, carried partway there inside the sun's own golden cup. Golden apples found only after a shape-shifting sea god was held still long enough to answer honestly, after a titan's endless burden was carried, just for a while, on someone else's shoulders instead. And finally, a three-headed hound met at the very gates of the dead, held the same patient way as that very first lion, all those labours ago. After the labours came more years, quieter ones, a new marriage, a courtship against a river god who could not outlast a steady grip no matter how many shapes he borrowed, a family built again slowly out of ordinary days. And then, at the very end, a mistake made out of love rather than malice, a poisoned gift meant to protect a marriage instead ending a life, a mountaintop a fire, and finally gently a lifting upward into the stars themselves, where he still rests tonight, quiet and enormous, turning slowly overhead the same way he has turned every single night for thousands of years, asking nothing else of anyone, especially not of you. That is the whole shape of it, from a stretched night in Thebes to a quiet constellation in tonight's sky. You do not need to remember any more of it than that. Let the rest of it rest exactly where it is. And let yourself rest now too. Let's slow down once more, all the way down, for these final few minutes, because there is no reason left tonight to hurry toward anything. Bring your attention back to your breath one last time, and let it move exactly as slowly as it wants to now. No counting required anymore, no pattern to follow, just breath, moving in and moving out, on its own unhurried schedule. Think, if you'd like, of the very last image this story leaves us with, Hercules resting among the stars, no longer a hunted man serving an anxious king, no longer a grieving husband carrying more sorrow than any one person should have to hold, simply a quiet shape in the night sky, turning slowly overhead the way it has turned every single night for thousands of years, asking nothing of anyone below it, offering nothing but its own steady, patient presence. That is exactly what this story is offering you right now too. Nothing required, nothing expected, just a steady, patient presence carrying you gently the rest of the way towards sleep. If it would help, imagine that same night sky stretched out and somewhere above your own ceiling right now, invisible behind the walls and the roof, but they're all the same, ancient and enormous and entirely unbothered by anything happening in your particular room tonight. Somewhere within that vast, quiet spread of stars, Hercules is resting exactly where he has always rested, and you, warm and heavy-limbed beneath your own blankets, are simply doing the same thing he finally learned to do at the very end of his own long, difficult story, setting everything down and allowing yourself completely to rest. There is nothing left to carry from this story now. No labour waiting to be completed. No king waiting anxiously behind a bronze jar for the next report. No sky pressing down on tired shoulders. Just quiet, just stillness, just the soft, steady weight of your own body, sinking gently, completely into sleep. Let's spend these last few minutes simply resting inside the feeling of an ending well earned, because that is, in the end, exactly what this whole long night has been building slowly toward. Think back, if you'd like, one final time, to that infant in the bronze shield, small hands closing calmly around two serpents in the dark, utterly unaware of everything still waiting ahead of him. The labours, the grief, the long roads, the golden apples, the underworld, the fire on the mountain, and finally the quiet stars. He could not have known, that first night, how long or how difficult the road ahead would be. None of us ever really can, at the beginning of anything. We simply take the next step, and then the next, the same patient way Hercules did, across an entire lifetime of steps, until eventually, looking back, An impossible distance has somehow already been covered. You have covered a distance tonight too, in your own quiet way, an entire long story listened to, or half listened to, or drifted in and out of, the way any long night of listening usually goes. There is nothing more required of you now. No more labours to walk through, no more monsters to imagine defeated in careful, patient detail. Just this last, soft stretch of quiet, settling slowly over the way dusk settles gently over a long day. Not an ending exactly, but a soft, unhurried fading, one shade darker at a time, until everything, story and listener both, finally rests. Feel your whole body now, heavy and still, exactly where it belongs, exactly where it has been resting this entire time. There is nowhere else to be, nothing else to carry, just this quiet, complete stillness, wrapping gently around you the same way the night sky wraps gently around a single, enormous resting constellation, unhurried, ancient, and completely finally at peace. Before the very last words of tonight's story, let's take one more slow, deliberate breath together. The last one will count out loud tonight. Breathe in gently for a count of 4, feeling your chest rise slowly, without any effort behind it. Hold that breath softly for a count of 4, no tension in it at all, just a quiet pause, the same kind of pause that settled over the whole ancient world on the night Hercules was born. A held breath before everything that followed, and now let it go slowly for a count of 6, longer on the way out than it was on the way in. Your whole body settling a little further down into the bed beneath you as the breath leaves, shoulders looser, jaw looser, hands completely empty and still. From here, there's no need to count anything else. No need to follow anything else closely. Just let your breath continue on its own unhurried rhythm. In and out, the way it has been doing this entire night without you needing to think about it at all. The way it will keep doing, quietly, faithfully, all the way through until morning, somewhere above the room you're resting in right now, whether you can see it tonight or not. That same old constellation is turning slowly overhead, exactly where it has always been, exactly where it will still be tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night for as long as there are people left to look up and remember the story carved into its stars. You don't need to look up tonight. You don't need to do anything at all. Just let yourself rest, completely. The way this whole long story has been gently, patiently, leading you toward the entire time. There's a particular kind of comfort in knowing that a story this old has been used for thousands of years now, for almost exactly the purpose you're using it for tonight. Not to educate, not to entertain in any loud or urgent way, but simply to ease a tired mind toward rest. Long before television, long before any screen at all, parents and grandparents across the ancient Mediterranean would have told pieces of this exact story to restless children unable to settle down for the night, softening the frightening parts, lingering on the calmer stretches, letting their own voices grow slower and quieter as the story wound down. The exact same shape this telling has taken tonight. There is a kind of quiet lineage in that. A story passed down, not just in its content, but in its purpose. Generation after generation of tired people, young and old, finding in Hercules' long, patient endurance something worth carrying into their own rest. You are simply the newest listener in a very, very long line of them, stretching back further than any single memory could hold, all the way back to a small stone house in Thebes, and a mother finally, gratefully, closing her own tired eyes after a very long night. Let yourself be exactly that tonight too, simply the newest in a very long line of tired listeners, carried gently towards sleep by a story that has done this same quiet work for thousands of years before you, and will keep doing it, patiently, for thousands of years still to come, long after tonight, long after tomorrow, turning slowly overhead the whole time, the way it always has, and the way it always will. If any small part of tonight's story is still turning quietly in your mind right now, a lion in the dark, a river bent gently from its course, a sky held briefly on borrowed shoulders, Let it turn there a little longer, softly, without any need to follow it closely or make sense of it further. Thoughts drifting towards sleep rarely need to be tidy. They can simply drift, loosely connected, one soft image folding into the next. The way the whole of this story has folded gently from one labour into another all night long, until eventually, without any clear moment marking the change, thought becomes dream, and dream becomes the deep, quiet rest that this entire long night has been leading you toward from the very first word. There is nothing left to hold on to now. No labour left uncompleted, no thread left hanging. No part of this story still waiting to be finished. Everything has been told, everything has been carried gently all the way through to its end. All that remains now is stillness, warm and heavy and complete, settling over you exactly the way it finally settled, so long ago, over a tired hero resting among his stars. Let's take one final, unhurried pass through the feeling of the whole story, before we let it close completely. Not the events of it anymore, just the feeling, warm and slow and settled, the way the last light of a long sunset feels just before it finally fades into full dark. Everything that needed to happen in this story has already happened. Every labour completed, every grief carried through, every long road finally walked to its end. There is nothing left now but the quiet that comes after, the particular, hard-earned stillness of a story, and a listener, both finally allowed to rest. If you have been drifting in and out through these last many minutes, catching pieces here and there between longer stretches of half-sleep, that is exactly how a story like this one is meant to be received, not held onto tightly, but allowed to move through you loosely. The way warm water moves through cupped hands, most of it slipping quietly away, only a little of it needing to stay. You don't need to remember the order of the labours, or the names of every god and monster mentioned tonight. You only need to remember this last, simple feeling, heavy-limbed, unhurried, safe, resting now exactly the way Hercules himself finally rested, after everything. Among the quiet stars, one last quiet thought before the final words of tonight's story. Every single night, all across the world, in countless languages, in countless different rooms, someone is doing exactly what you are doing right now, letting a slow, unhurried voice carry them gently away from a day that asked too much of them, toward a rest that asks nothing at all. You are not alone in this particular kind of tiredness, and you are not alone in this particular kind of quiet. Thousands of years of tired listeners came before you, gathered around fires, lying awake in unfamiliar rooms, waiting for a story exactly like this one to finally loosen the grip their own minds had on them. And now it's your turn, warm and heavy, and finally, completely ready to rest. Let's slow down one final time, all the way down, for the very last stretch of this long night together. Feel the weight of your own body now, completely settled, completely still, every muscle finally given full permission to let go entirely. There is no task left waiting anywhere in this story, no labour still uncompleted, no king anxiously waiting behind a bronze jar for one more report. Everything Hercules was ever asked to carry has been set down now, permanently, and everything you have been carrying through your own long day can be set down too, right here, right now, with nothing left to hold on to except the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing, slower now than it was even a few minutes ago, and slower still with every breath that follows it. Somewhere above you tonight, unseen but certain, that same old shape still turns slowly through the dark, exactly where it has always been, exactly where it will still be tomorrow, and the night after, and every quiet night that follows, for as long as there are tired people left in the world who need a story like this one to finally carry them toward rest. You do not need to look up to know it's there. You only need to let your own eyes close completely now and let the last of this long story settle gently over you, the way it has been settling, slowly, patiently, this entire night, one soft word at a time. There's a last, small footnote worth including here too. about the way this story has been passed down through so many careful hands before ever reaching yours tonight. Translators working slowly through old Greek verse centuries after it was first composed, scholars comparing fragments from different regions to piece together the fullest possible version of each labour, illustrators choosing exactly how to depict a lion's mane or a hydra's many heads for readers who would never see the original ancient sculptures carved in its honour. Every single person along that long chain, poet, translator, scholar, illustrator, added their own small, careful contribution to the version of this story that eventually found its way here, to this quiet room tonight. It is a strange thought to sit with for just a moment, how many careful, patient hands it actually took, across thousands of years, simply to make sure a story like this one survived long enough to still be worth telling. And yet none of that long chain of careful work was ever really about the story surviving for its own sake. It survived because it kept being useful, kept being comforting, kept doing exactly what it's doing for you right now, easing a tired mind a little further toward rest. That is the real reason this story has lasted so long, not because anyone insisted it must be preserved, but because tired people, generation after generation, kept quietly needing it. You are the newest link in that very long chain now, and there is nothing more required of you except to let the story finish doing its quiet work, exactly the way it has for everyone who came before you. Let your whole body settle, one final time, fully into stillness. Let your breathing slow to its natural, unhurried rhythm. Let every last small worry from today soften and blur, the way every detail of this long story has been softening and blurring for a while now too. There is nothing left to hold on to. Only rest, warm and complete, waiting exactly where it has been waiting this entire night, ready now, finally to receive you. Let this be the very last image tonight, then, before the final words close this story completely, a wide dark sky, thick with stars, a single enormous kneeling shape resting quietly among them, unhurried, ancient at peace, and somewhere far below that sky, warm beneath your own blankets, your body heavy, your breathing slow and steady, your mind finally, fully, letting go of everything it carried through the day. There is nothing left to do now, nothing left to finish. Only this, the soft, settled stillness of a story completely told, and a listener completely, gently at rest. And so, at last, after 12 labours, 2 marriages, a lifetime of grief carried patiently alongside just as much quiet joy, a fire on a mountaintop, and a gentle lifting upward into the stars, the story of Hercules finally comes to its true and complete rest tonight. Exactly where it was always going to end, in stillness, in peace, and in the deep, unhurried quiet of a very long, very well-earned sleep. This is where we'll leave Hercules tonight, resting among the stars, his labours long finished, his name still quietly carried forward by languages and gyms and museum statues he never could have imagined existing. Thank you for spending these 3 quiet hours here, on Boring History Narrative, letting an old story about an impossibly strong man carry you gently toward a rest of your own. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. If your body still feels alert in any small way, let that alertness soften, the way the Nemean Lion's resistance finally softened in total darkness, the way the Hydra's many heads finally stopped multiplying once each wound was sealed, the way even Atlas's endless burden finally briefly found a moment of rest. You do not need to do anything else tonight. No more labours, no more tasks, no more sky to hold up on tight shoulders. Just the quiet weight of your own body, sinking a little deeper into stillness with every breath. If tonight's story helped your mind finally slow down, consider subscribing to Boring History Narrative, so the next time sleep doesn't come easily on its own. Another slow, unhurried story through the ancient world will already be here waiting for you. There's no need to reply, no need to remember any of the details by morning, no need to do anything at all except let this be the last thing your mind holds onto tonight. Sleep well, rest completely, and good night.